In 2010, a 17-year-old boy was devastated when his father suddenly passed away. The loss shattered the family. Not only did they grieve for their husband and father, but the spaces where they had shared the happiest memories suddenly felt hollow. One of those places was their cabin near Mount Bachelor in Oregon, a beautiful retreat where the family had spent winters skiing, snowboarding, and hunting together. After the father's death, the family decided to sell the cabin. But before it was gone forever, the boy asked his mother if he could spend a few days there, one last chance to honor his father's memory in the place they loved so much. She agreed, and with his father's car, which had been willed to him, and the family dog Midnight, he set out for the cabin with snacks, drinks, and plans to play games, snowboard, and remember, the cabin itself was 2 stories built into the side of the mountain. The back was pressed into the slope with no windows except a small one in the bathroom. The front was wide open, lined with glass panes and a balcony off the master bedroom. It stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by dense pine forest. Among the trees in front of the house was one that stood out, a tall pine with a thick horizontal branch about 20 feet up, perfectly shaped like a seat facing the cabin. The boy called it the sitting tree. For the first 2 days, the stay was everything he had hoped for. He played video games, ate snacks, took Midnight out to roam, and even went snowboarding. It felt almost like he was bonding with his father again. But on the 3rd morning, after a heavy snowstorm, he stepped outside with Midnight and noticed something that unsettled him. Fresh footprints in the snow prints that weren't his led from the woods to the clearing and then circled around the back of the cabin, disappearing up the slope. He told himself it must have been a hiker or a neighbor, though both were unlikely. Still, he forced himself to shake it off. That night, he locked every door and window, drew the blackout curtains, and went upstairs to bed with Midnight. Hours later, the dog suddenly perked up, staring at the stairs. Then, without warning, she bolted down to the front door, pacing and whining to be let out. Uneasy, the boy finally gave in, opened the door, and followed Midnight into the snow. Instead of using the bathroom, she froze, staring toward the tree line, body tense, her gaze locked on to the sitting tree. The boy's nerves flared. He grabbed the dog, dragged her back inside, locked the door, shut the blinds, and went upstairs. Midnight refused to get into bed, choosing instead to stand near the stairs, ears pricked, body on edge. Minutes passed in silence. Then came the sound. 6 distinct, deliberate footsteps directly above him, on the roof. They sounded heavy, not like an animal's paws, but like hooves, clopping slowly from one side of the cabin to the other. His blood ran cold. There was no way a deer or moose could climb onto the roof. Midnight stared at the ceiling, then whipped her head toward the balcony door, growling low in her throat. Terrified but desperate to know, the boy mustered the courage to slide open the blackout curtain. The balcony was buried in snow, the night thick and silent. He opened the door, flashlight in hand, and swept the beam across the roof. Nothing. Then he scanned the clearing, the trees, the sitting tree. And there, perched 20 feet up on that thick branch, crouched a figure. A tall man, impossibly balanced, clutching the branch above him, mouth open wide, eyes locked, unblinking on the boy. The flashlight slipped from his hand, heart pounding. He fumbled to pick it up, swung the beam back toward the tree, but the branch was empty. No man, no sound, just the black wall of forest. He yanked Midnight inside, slammed the door, locked it, and pulled the curtains shut. Upstairs, they huddled together in bed. Midnight no longer wanted to go outside. Then came the tapping. Soft at first, like a single finger rapping against glass. At the front door. Then silence. Then tapping again, this time on the walls, moving slowly around the cabin. He held his breath, listening as it shifted to the tiny bathroom window just feet from where he lay. Then it circled the house, tapping each side in turn. He could picture it walking in slow circles around his home, testing every wall, every window, as if it was deciding where to come in. Hours dragged by. Then came the heaviest blow, footsteps on the balcony. And then the tapping again right on the sliding glass doors to his bedroom. The sound was inches away, separated only by thin curtains and glass. He couldn't move. He couldn't even breathe. The tapping continued, steady, patient. Then it stopped and began again on the roof, directly above him. He lay frozen in terror as the sound went on and on, until finally the first light of dawn broke through. When the sun rose, he pulled the curtains back. The balcony was empty, but footprints stamped the snow footprints that paced back and forth all night long. He looked up at the roof and saw more tracks. They circled the cabin like a predator stalking prey, then trailed off toward the sitting tree before vanishing into the woods. Shaken and exhausted, he packed his things, loaded Midnight into the car, and left. The cabin was sold shortly after. He never returned. It was around 8:30 p.m. on December 29th, 1972, when passengers at JFK International Airport in Queens, New York, heard over the intercom that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami was now boarding. About 30 minutes later, all 176 people, including 13 crew members, were seated on board. This wasn't just any airplane. Flight 401 was one of Eastern's brand new Lockheed L-1011 TriStars, a massive, state-of-the-art jet capable of holding up to 400 passengers. It had two levels, the main cabin above and a lower deck with a galley kitchen and a lounge just for the crew. That night, Captain Robert Bob Loft was in command. He was 55, strikingly handsome, a perfectionist, with more than 30 zero-hours of flight time. Sitting to his right was First Officer Bert Stockstill, 10 years younger. Behind them was the flight engineer, Don Repo, a strong man with a gentle, approachable demeanor. And in the fourth cockpit seat was Angelo Donadeo, another Eastern Airlines employee hitching a ride to Miami. At 9:20 p.m., Flight 401 thundered down the runway and climbed into the night sky. For the next 2 hours, everything was routine. One passenger, Jerry Eskow, was so impressed that he even wrote a letter mid-flight praising Eastern for how smooth the trip was, intending to mail it when they landed. But at 11:32 p.m., everything changed. As Captain Loft began his approach into Miami, he lowered the landing gear. On the L-1011, there are 3 sets of wheels, one under each wing and one under the nose. Each set has a corresponding green indicator light in the cockpit that comes on when the gear locks into place. This time, only 2 lights came on. The nose gear light stayed dark. Loft and his crew assumed the landing gear was fine, the plane was brand new, the problem had to be the bulb. But to be safe, Loft retracted the gear and lowered it again. Still, the nose gear light did not illuminate. Frustrated, he radioed Miami Air Traffic Control, explaining the situation. They instructed him to circle out over the Everglades until the issue was resolved. Loft engaged the autopilot to hold 0 feet and 200 miles per hour, while he and Stockstill fiddled with the tiny bulb. They pressed it, twisted it, even pulled it out and blew on it. Nothing. When they jammed it back in, sideways, and couldn't remove it, Loft turned to Repo and told him to climb down into the hellhole, a small compartment beneath the cockpit with a window where you could visually confirm if the nose gear was down. Repo got out of his seat and climbed below. What no one noticed was that when Loft turned in his chair to speak to Repo, he likely nudged the control column just enough to disengage the autopilot. The massive jet began a slow, steady descent, but it was pitch black outside, no moon, no lights, just an endless void. The descent was so gradual, it didn't feel like falling. And everyone in the cockpit was so focused on that single light bulb that when the altitude warning sounded quietly, just once, it went unnoticed. At 11:42 p.m., Flight 401 slammed into the Everglades at more than 200 miles per hour. 5 miles away, a man named Robert Marquis, out hunting frogs with a friend on an airboat, saw the massive orange flash. He fired up his boat and sped toward it. The impact was catastrophic, but oddly survivable for some. Because the descent was shallow and the Everglades were soft, muddy terrain, the crash wasn't as instantly fatal as it might have been. Of the 176 on board, 77 survived: Captain Loft, First Officer Stockstill and Flight Engineer Repo did not. Marquis and his friend were the first on scene, pulling survivors from the wreckage until Coast Guard helicopters arrived. By morning, the cries for help had gone silent. The investigation would reveal the nose gear had been fine all along. The light bulb had simply burned out. The official cause was human error. But that was not the end of Flight 401's story. In the months and years that followed, something strange began happening inside Eastern Airlines. Employees started reporting eerie encounters, ghostly apparitions of Captain Loft, of Don Repo. Silent, watchful, appearing on flights that had salvaged parts taken from the wreckage of 401. Eastern Airlines pressured employees to stay quiet. Reports were buried. Logbooks went missing. But some crew members, shaken by what they'd seen, came forward anonymously. One flight attendant swore she saw Repo in the galley kitchen. Another time, during boarding, an extra captain appeared in first class. He sat silently, staring straight ahead. When approached, he gave no response. Then, in front of multiple witnesses, including crew and passengers, he vanished into thin air. That captain was identified as Bob Loft. There were dozens of such sightings, sometimes terrifying, sometimes helpful. On one flight, Repo's apparition reportedly warned a captain about a malfunction in an engine. When checked, the malfunction was real. By 1974, all the sightings suddenly stopped. Why? Eastern Airlines quietly removed all salvaged parts from their L-1011 fleet. They never gave a reason. But after that, the ghosts of Flight 401 were never seen again. On the evening of January 12, 2016, 18-year-old Dylan Parker was at a party in his hometown of Osburn, Idaho. Late into the night, he decided it was time to leave. Since it was snowing and bitterly cold outside, Dylan phoned his mother and asked if she could meet him at the gas station just down the road from where the party was being held. When his mother answered, she could immediately tell Dylan had been drinking. His voice was slurred, and he sounded unsteady. She was angry because he was underage, but despite her frustration, her priority was to get her son home safely. She told herself she could deal with his behavior tomorrow, and she agreed to pick him up. As she drove toward the gas station, her phone rang again. This time, Dylan's voice was frantic, panicked. He demanded to know where she was, sounding almost terrified. His mother tried to calm him down, explaining she was only a minute away and would be there shortly. Then the call suddenly ended. When she pulled into the gas station, Dylan was nowhere to be seen. She tried to call him back, but now his phone was switched off. She went inside the gas station, asking if anyone had seen her son. The employees said no. Back in her car, she drove around for half an hour, shouting Dylan's name, but there was no trace of him. His phone remained off, a sick feeling grew in her stomach, and eventually she contacted the police to report him missing. Investigators began by searching the party house where Dylan had last been seen. Friends confirmed that he seemed fine when he left, simply telling them his mom was picking him up. Authorities expanded their search across town, but they came up empty. For days, nothing turned up. Then, 10 days later, Dylan's body was discovered by accident. Two people had crashed their ATVs during a late-night ride. When they returned the next day to retrieve their vehicles, they stumbled upon Dylan's remains. His body was found outside of town, high on a forested hillside. To reach this location, Dylan would have had to walk in the opposite direction of the gas station. Toxicology reports showed he had consumed alcohol, but locals knew Dylan was familiar with the area. The gas station was in the well-lit center of town. It would have been obvious to him he was heading the wrong way, deeper into darkness. Yet somehow, he ended up on that isolated hill. The details surrounding the discovery were even stranger. On the night Dylan disappeared, there was plenty of snow on the ground. In the 10 days until his body was found, no new snowfall occurred, nor had temperatures warmed enough to melt existing snow. If Dylan had walked into the forest, his footprints should still have been visible. But there were no tracks at all around where his body was found. No footprints, no tire marks, nothing. It looked as though he had simply been dropped from the sky. Another unsettling detail, Dylan's pants and boots were missing. Given the rough, snowy terrain he would have had to cross, Investigators expected his socks to be filthy, torn, maybe even soaked in blood from cuts. Instead, his socks were clean and his feet showed no injuries at all. It was as though he had somehow arrived there without ever hiking through the woods. Despite extensive searches by officers and tracking dogs, his missing clothing and boots were never found. The official cause of death was ruled hypothermia. But David Roos, the deputy coroner, publicly expressed his doubts. He argued that the circumstances didn't add up and that Dylan may have been attacked. Local authorities insisted it was an accident, and not only did they refuse to reopen the investigation, they went so far as to fire David Roos, claiming he was unfit for the role. He, however, maintains they dismissed him simply to silence his objections. And so the unsettling questions remain. How did Dylan end up on that hillside without leaving tracks in the snow? Why were his pants and boots missing? And why were his socks clean and his feet uninjured despite the treacherous terrain? Unless someone speaks up, the truth behind Dylan Parker's final night may never be known. Dustin Self grew up in Piedmont, Oklahoma, a small town located just northwest of Oklahoma City. Throughout his childhood and early teens, Dustin was an average student. His grades were nothing spectacular, and he didn't seem to take academics too seriously. But during his senior year of high school, he discovered weightlifting, and everything began to change. It gave him purpose, structure, and confidence. His dedication to fitness carried over into his academics, and by graduation, he was not only in great physical shape, but had also dramatically improved his grades. Despite this positive turnaround, Dustin didn't follow the expected path after high school. He didn't enroll in college, get a steady job, or spend more time with friends and family. Instead, he became fascinated with the idea of living alone in the wilderness. His parents believed this was inspired by the movie Into the Wild, the true story of Christopher McCandless, who abandoned a promising future to survive in the wilds of Alaska. Tragically, McCandless died there, reportedly from starvation or possibly from eating a toxic plant. A year after Dustin graduated, at 19 years old, he finally decided to pursue his own version of that dream. It was March 2013, and he told his family he planned to embark on a cross-country road trip. Along the way, he would stop in different places and live off the land. His family worried, but knew he was determined and couldn't be talked out of it. They gave him their blessing, warning him only to be careful. At the beginning of March, Dustin hit the road. For nearly 2 weeks, no one heard from him. Then, on March 15, he called his parents. He told them he was in a tiny town called Fields, Oregon, standing at a gas station. He reassured them he was fine, everything was going smoothly, and they didn't need to worry. But the next day, Dustin called his ex-girlfriend instead, and this time, he was in clear distress. Over the phone, he told her he was lost on a mountain. She was at the airport at the time, about to board a plane, and the background noise made it hard to hear. She stepped into a bathroom to listen more carefully, but his words still didn't make sense. He rambled about being lost, about people chasing him, and sounded completely disoriented. Before she could ask for clarification, Dustin abruptly hung up. Alarmed, she tried calling back, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Worried, she reached out to Dustin's father, relaying the strange call and emphasizing how frightened he had sounded. His father immediately began trying to reach his son, but every call went unanswered. By the next day, still unable to get through, he contacted police. The problem was, no one knew where to begin searching. Dustin hadn't said which mountain he was on. The only concrete information was his last known stop, the gas station in Fields, Oregon. Investigators went there hoping to learn more, but the staff didn't recall seeing him, and nobody in town knew anything. With no leads, they were forced to wait, hoping new information would surface. A month passed before the next clue appeared. A ranch worker in a remote area not far from Fields stumbled upon Dustin's abandoned truck teetering on the edge of a canyon road. Inside were Dustin's GPS device, food, and energy drinks. Missing, however, were his backpack, sleeping bag, and tent. Despite extensive searches around the vehicle, nothing else was found, and the search was eventually called off. The area where his truck was discovered was rugged but relatively open. The terrain was rocky and hilly but not heavily forested, Anyone standing on one of the ridges could easily spot a nearby road. Searchers couldn't understand how Dustin could have gotten lost there. From almost any vantage point, the way to safety should have been obvious. 6 months later, a hunter was moving quietly through a sparse grove of aspen trees near where Dustin's truck had been found. He thought he saw a deer and crept closer. But when he stepped into a small clearing, what he discovered instead stopped him cold. Beneath a bush was the body of a man, naked, positioned on hands and knees, with his head seemingly forced into the ground. The hunter immediately alerted police. When investigators arrived, they searched the area thoroughly. Nearby, they found a jacket containing a wallet and car keys. The identification inside confirmed the body belonged to Dustin Self. He was located 9 miles uphill from where his truck had been abandoned. Strangely, there was no trace of a campsite. His missing backpack, tent, and sleeping bag were never recovered. Authorities concluded Dustin never set up camp at all. His family was heartbroken and bewildered. His father, in particular, couldn't understand why Dustin hadn't simply sought shelter in his truck. He was in excellent physical condition. 9 miles would have been tough, but doable. And from the mountaintops, he could have easily seen the roads. Yet, for reasons no one can explain, he left his vehicle and traveled into unforgiving terrain. Investigators ruled out foul play and said there was no evidence Dustin intended to harm himself. The official cause of death was believed to be hypothermia, but due to the decomposition of the body, it couldn't be confirmed. The disturbing circumstances, the nudity, the missing gear, the inexplicable decision-making remain unexplained. Like so many other missing 411 cases, Dustin's story leaves behind more questions than answers. Why abandon his truck with supplies inside? Why walk 9 miles into the hills, discarding clothes and equipment along the way? And why did he die in such a strange, almost staged position, head driven into the ground? To this day, no one knows. In 2010, Jan Maccabee was living in Lima, Ohio, with her husband, Bruce. Lima sat about 80 miles southwest of Lake Erie. Jan had built a thriving career as a booking agent for musicians, entertainers, and bands, but her true passion had always been deer hunting. When hunting season opened that September, she was eager to get out into the woods. On the morning of September 29, the weather was gray, damp, and chilly. But by the afternoon, when Jan was preparing to head out, the sun had broken through and the temperatures warmed. She told Bruce around 5 p.m. that she was leaving, and by 5:30, she had reached her tree stand. This wasn't some deep wilderness, just a patch of forest she knew well. There were houses nearby, farmland, and even a high school a mile north where her nephew attended, but from her tree stand, all she could see were trees. Jan's favorite hunting method was to climb 15 feet up into her stand with her bow and arrow and wait for deer to wander past. Once settled in, she began casually texting a friend on her BlackBerry, glancing up occasionally to scan for deer. Throughout, she could hear the normal soundtrack of the woods, squirrels rustling, crickets chirping, birds calling. Around 6 p.m., her texting conversation tapered off. She returned to simply watching her surroundings. By 6:20, no deer had appeared, and boredom began to creep in. To pass the time, she decided to take a selfie. She snapped a photo, lowered her phone, and instantly noticed something was wrong. The forest had gone utterly silent. Every bird, every cricket, every squirrel, it was as if someone had flipped a switch. Jan was an experienced hunter, and she knew this type of silence usually meant a large predator was nearby. But this felt different. The stillness was too sudden, too complete, it frightened her. She quickly texted her friend again. The woods just went completely silent, very odd. The moment she sent the message and lowered her phone, she froze. About 20 feet away, in the branches of a tree across from her, something was moving. What she saw was the strangest and most terrifying thing she had ever laid eyes on. It looked like a shimmering distortion, as though the air itself was alive. She compared it to the mirage you see on a hot day above pavement, except this had shape, mass, and intent. To Jan, it resembled the faint outline of a person wrapped in transparent plastic. Convinced it might be her eyesight, she rubbed her eyes. But when she looked again, the figure had shifted closer, perched on a lower branch, as though it were watching her. Panicked but determined to document it, Jan lifted her BlackBerry and snapped another photo. Just then, the strange distortion slipped behind the tree and vanished. Seconds later, the sounds of the forest returned as abruptly as they had stopped. Birds, crickets, squirrels, everything was back to normal. Jan sat trembling, unsure of what she had just witnessed. She kept staring at the spot where the thing had disappeared, trying to steady her nerves. Eventually, she looked at the photo she had taken. The image was a blur, distorted and unclear. She thought she must have covered the lens or let her hair get in the way. Still, she was unsettled. She knew she had held the phone properly, and her hair had been tied back under a cap. When she got home, Jan said nothing to her husband. She tried to laugh it off as her imagination. That evening, they ate dinner and sat together scrolling on their phones. At one point, Bruce reacted to an email he'd received. Curious, Jan asked what it was. He explained their nephew had sent him a message. During band practice at the high school near the woods, he and his classmates had seen a glowing circular light hovering inside the forest. They watched it for several seconds before it retreated back into the trees. One student remarked the same thing had happened a year earlier, spooking the instructor enough to cancel rehearsal. Jan sat upright, heart pounding. She asked Bruce what time the sighting had occurred. He checked the email. Between 7:50 and 8 p.m. Jan then told him everything, how the woods went silent, the distortion she saw, the photo she tried to take. She showed him the blurry image. Bruce, an optical physicist by profession, immediately examined the photo. His first question was whether her hair had blocked the lens. Jan assured him it hadn't. Then he asked if her finger could have covered it. She admitted it was possible, but unlikely. As he looked closer, something caught his attention. The image resolution was wrong. Her BlackBerry could only take photos in 3 sizes, small, medium, or large. But this picture was in none of those categories. It was an odd in-between size that the device shouldn't even have been able to produce. To confirm, Bruce checked other photos Jan had taken that day. They all matched the expected resolutions. Only this one was an anomaly. Intrigued, Bruce began running experiments to replicate the image. No matter what he tried, he couldn't reproduce the strange distortion. Because he trusted his wife's honesty and had full confidence in her account, Bruce concluded something external had interfered with the photo. He believed whatever Jan had seen in the trees had physically altered the resolution. Later, Jan would learn that many people in the area reported strange lights and unexplained phenomena in those same woods. Paranormal investigators, including Ed and Lorraine Warren, had once studied them. Her photograph, however, remained the most puzzling piece of evidence. Bruce eventually published his findings online, detailing how the photo's irregular resolution pointed to a third-party influence. To this day, the couple is convinced that Jan truly encountered something unexplainable in the forest that evening.
In June of 2019, and one 8-year-old named Lena had just finished her first year of college and returned home for summer break. Her family lived near a small village in France, tucked up against the mountains and bordered by an enormous forest. Lena had grown up wandering that forest, often alone, but sometimes with her father or siblings, and she knew the terrain like the back of her hand. Her favorite spot was a man-made lake hidden near the center of the woods. Though modest in size, the lake was breathtakingly scenic and incredibly peaceful, making it her personal sanctuary. To reach it, Lena would leave her home, drive a few miles down a rural road, and park on a narrow shoulder. There were no signs indicating the trailhead. Her family had simply discovered this hidden route years earlier. From the roadside, she would step directly into the trees, pushing through dense brush until she reached a small clearing. Ahead, a narrow stream cut through the forest. On the left side of the stream was a faint path, really just an animal trail formed by wildlife passing through again and again. Lena would follow this rough track as it ran parallel with the water for 15 or 20 minutes until it veered sharply left away from the stream. At that point, she left the path behind and continued following the stream itself. Sometimes she hopped across rocks in the water, sometimes she stuck to the muddy banks, but always she kept moving north into the heart of the forest. After about an hour of steady walking, the stream intersected with a river running east to west. At that junction, she turned west and walked along the river for another 20 minutes until it spilled into the man-made lake. Once there, she usually perched on a rock, admired the scenery, listened to the birds, and soaked in the stillness. Eventually, she retraced her exact route back to the car. Each leg of the trip car to lake or lake to car took roughly 2 hours. Part of what made the lake so special to Lena was the privacy. Up until the summer of 2019, the only people she had ever encountered out there were her own family members. To her, it felt like a secret world that belonged to them alone. So when she returned from college that June, one of her first impulses was to revisit her favorite place. One morning, she woke early, set out alone, and began the familiar journey. She parked at the roadside, slipped into the forest, followed the animal trail and the stream, steadily making her way north. After about 30 minutes, still a mile or two short of the river, she heard something unusual. A bell. A single chime echoed faintly through the trees ahead of her in the direction she was heading. She froze. In all her years exploring this forest, she had never heard or seen anyone else out here. For a moment, she wondered if she'd imagined it, but then the sound returned sporadic rings, as though someone were loosely shaking a bell without rhythm. Lena thought about a lost dog with a bell collar, but it was too loud and resonant to be a pet trinket. Maybe, she considered, it was something drifting down the river in a box, clanging as it struck rocks. None of her theories made much sense, but she wasn't frightened, just curious. Since the ringing seemed to come from the very direction she was traveling anyway, she decided to keep going. She pressed forward for another 5 minutes, listening intently. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The abrupt silence startled her. She paused, waiting for it to start again. Nothing. Only the ordinary noises of the forest returned. With no explanation in sight, she shrugged it off and continued toward the lake. 15 minutes later, Lena was still walking along the stream when something caught her eye. Ahead on the left bank was a shape that might have been a rock or an animal. Drawing closer, she realized it was the body of a beaver. Its head was missing. Finding animal remains in the forest wasn't strange in itself. Predators left kills all the time, but the way this one had been decapitated sent a chill through her. The cut on its neck was disturbingly clean, as though made with a sharp blade. The head was nowhere nearby, and the rest of the body was untouched, suggesting it hadn't been killed for food. Kneeling closer, Lena noticed another unsettling detail. There was no smell. Fresh kills don't reek right away, but decomposition sets in quickly. The lack of odor suggested it had been killed very recently. Curious and uneasy, she nudged the body with her foot. It was still limp, rigor mortis hadn't begun. That meant whatever, or whoever, had killed this animal had likely done so not long ago. And given that the ringing bell had come from roughly the same direction, the thought hit her hard. Whatever was responsible could still be close by. After staring uneasily at the headless beaver, Lena forced herself to calm down. It was broad daylight, she reminded herself. She spent years in these woods, and never once had she run into danger. Surely there was a logical explanation. Stepping over the carcass, she continued on, eventually reaching the river, turning west, and walking until the lake appeared before her. She sat on a rock, admired the water, let the sounds of nature soothe her, and then retraced her steps back the way she'd come. Passing the beaver again, she followed the stream, hiked out of the woods, and drove home without incident. About a week later, restless at home, Lena decided to return to the lake. She told her parents where she was going, grabbed her keys, and drove to the familiar pull-off. It was around 6 in the evening, and with sunset scheduled for 9, she knew her window was limited. If she moved quickly, she could make it there and back before darkness set in. She entered the woods, found the animal path, then the stream, and began following it north. Soon, though, she heard the low rumble of thunder. Looking up, she saw the sky already darkening. Though sunset was still hours away, a storm was approaching fast. But Lena was determined. Instead of turning back, she broke into a jog, hoping to reach the lake before the rain became too heavy. It started with a sprinkle, but by the time she passed the beaver's corpse, Still lying in the same place as before, the sky opened up. Sheets of rain poured down. 15 minutes later, when she reached the river, the downpour was in full force. Still, she pressed on, turning west toward the lake. But only a couple minutes into this final stretch, she checked her watch. It was already after 8:00. She froze. Reaching the lake would mean another 40 minutes added to her round trip, and sunset was fast approaching. Even if she turned around now, it would take an hour to get back, much of it in the dark. Factor in the storm, the slippery ground, the risk of losing her way. She realized continuing was reckless. Reluctantly, she turned back toward home. The rain hammered down, soaking her clothes, dripping into her eyes. To keep her footing on the slick rocks, she walked with her head down. 15 minutes into a return journey, something smacked her hard on the top of her head. She gasped, threw up her hands, and looked up. Dangling directly above her, suspended by a rope from a tree branch, was the same beaver. Only now, its head had been stitched grotesquely to its front paws, as though it were holding it. The lifeless body swung in the storm, dripping water. Lena staggered back, gagging, rubbing furiously at her hair where it had brushed against her. But as her revulsion ebbed, another realization struck her. When she passed this exact spot 30 minutes earlier, the carcass had still been on the ground. Someone had returned in that short time, retrieved the beaver, mutilated it, and strung it up, which meant whoever had done it was probably still close. Her heart thudded in her chest. She whipped her head around, scanning the trees, but the forest was empty. Drenched, shaking, the light fading fast, she forced herself to keep moving. Lena edged past the dangling beaver, whispering to herself to stay calm. Just walk. Don't run. If she bolted, she feared panic would take over. But as soon as she left it behind, the hairs on her neck prickled. She could hear movement branches snapping, something pacing just out of sight. Her pace quickened despite her resolve until she broke into a full sprint, splashing through the stream, slipping on rocks, lungs burning. After several minutes, she stopped, doubled over, gasping for breath. That's when it returned the bell. Sporadic, uneven chimes, echoing through the trees. The same sound she'd heard the week before. Only now, in her panic, she couldn't tell where it was coming from. Left, right, behind every direction seemed filled with it, and it was getting closer. Terrified, she yanked her phone from her pocket, hands trembling, and dialed her father. When he answered, she sobbed into the receiver, barely able to form words. Between gasps, she begged him, "Come into the forest where the path splits from the stream, please. Hurry, someone's chasing me." On the other end, her father didn't ask questions. He could hear the primal terror in her voice, the bell faintly chiming in the background. Grabbing his wife, he bolted from the house. They sped to the roadside pull-off, parked next to Lena's car, and plunged into the forest with the phone still pressed to his ear. From both the woods around them and through the line, they heard the bell, each chime confirming their daughter wasn't imagining things. Meanwhile, Lena stumbled forward through the storm, exhaustion threatening to drop her. Her legs felt heavy, her lungs on fire. But the bell was louder now, almost on top of her. Sticks cracked, footsteps pounded the ground behind her. She broke into a small clearing, lit faintly by moonlight filtering through the storm clouds. She slowed, heart racing, and made the mistake of turning around. From the tree line opposite her, a figure emerged. Tall, shadowy. With each step, the large bell tied at its waist clanged violently, echoing into the night. Its movement was wrong, jerky, unnatural, not quite human. For an instant, Lena was frozen in disbelief. Then a surge of adrenaline hit her like lightning. She spun and ran harder than she ever had in her life. Behind her, the bell grew faster, louder, each time a footfall gaining on her. Desperate, she screamed into the storm, "The police are ahead! They're waiting for you!" But the figure didn't slow, it kept coming. At that same moment, Lena's father, unable to wait at the meeting point, sprinted deeper into the woods, following his daughter's screams. And then through the trees, he saw her. Lena burst into view, eyes wide with terror, sprinting straight toward him. He grabbed her, lifted her, and ran back toward his wife. The three of them didn't stop until they were out of the forest, back at the car, all of them crying, shaking, too shocked to speak. Later, at the police station, Lena filed a report. Officers searched the area the next morning, but the beaver was gone, her dropped bag was missing, and the only trace they found was a neatly folded t-shirt placed under a rock near the stream. The authorities suggested it was probably a disturbed person living in the forest who wanted to scare her away. But Lena couldn't accept that. In her mind, the figure wasn't just trying to frighten her, it was hunting her. And had her father not reached her in time, she was certain she wouldn't have made it out alive. Even now, when Lena looks back, one memory stands out most vividly: the way that shadowy figure moved in the moonlight. Wrong, unnatural, less like a man, more like a creature. And though no one has reported sighting since, Lena and her family never set foot in those woods again.
On April 15, 2018, a 56-year-old woman named Hana Mori was dusting a piano inside her family's small but spotless home in the English village of Helmsley. This was part of her regular routine. After wiping down the outside of the piano, Hana carefully lifted the lid and began cleaning each key one by one. But while she did this, she was very cautious not to accidentally press any of the keys and produce a sound. That was the last thing she wanted. Every time Hana had to clean the piano, she dreaded it, because she was terrified of making noise. Once Hana had finished dusting both the outside and inside, she lowered the lid and moved over to a bookshelf near the window, where she began wiping down the spines of the books. As she dusted, the sound of birds outside drifted in through the open window, along with cars passing and neighbors chatting. Hana paused, gazing out at the charming town, the rows of stone cottages, and listening to the life outside. A wave of sadness washed over her. She was reminded of all the things she was missing out on. Once, Hana had been a world-class pianist. She had studied at the Royal College of Music, one of London's most prestigious institutions. She had played sold-out symphony halls, sometimes with members of the royal family in the audience. She had been a big deal. But now, Hana didn't play the piano at all because of her younger sister Keiko. The moment Hana thought of Keiko, anger rose up inside her. Her eyes drifted toward Keiko's bedroom door, which was always closed. For just a second, Hana wished her younger sister had never come home. Because ever since Keiko's return, it was as if the entire family had decided nothing else mattered. Keiko was the only thing that counted. The Mori family consisted of Hana, her 49-year-old sister Keiko, their 51-year-old brother Daisuke, and their 80-year-old mother. Their father had passed away years earlier. Hana and Daisuke were both accomplished in their own ways. Hana, the brilliant pianist, and Daisuke, a gifted writer. But Keiko was on a completely different level. She spoke fluent English, Latin, Greek, and Japanese, and she had even invented her own dialect of Japanese, complete with grammar rules. She was also a phenomenal artist. Her paintings were in such high demand, but Keiko almost never sold them, which only increased the mystique and value around her work. As a child, Keiko had received scholarships to elite private schools. After high school, she earned a full scholarship to the University of Cambridge, one of the top universities in the world. Everyone assumed she was destined to become a world-famous artist. But Keiko had a darker side. She was prone to sudden fits of anger that no one could explain. These violent flashes of temper didn't fit the rest of her personality. Most people excused them as quirks of her brilliance, thinking her extraordinary mind simply couldn't contain itself at times. But when she graduated from Cambridge and came back home, something inside her snapped and stayed broken. A few days after returning, Keiko had one of her explosive outbursts, except this time the rage didn't fade. She remained angry for days, then weeks. Her family tried to understand what had upset her, but she wouldn't say. Eventually, Keiko locked herself in her bedroom and refused to come out. For weeks, she isolated herself. And when she finally did emerge, she was completely different. She barely spoke to anyone, including her family. She only left her room when absolutely necessary. Soon, this wasn't just a phase. It became her life. Keiko became a recluse, shutting herself inside that darkened bedroom for decades. The family's neighbors didn't even know she existed. Back at the bookshelf, Hana finished dusting the books and set her cloth aside. Then, she tiptoed to Keiko's door and gave the gentlest knock. Keiko despised loud noises. That's why Hana wasn't allowed to play piano anymore. It was too loud. After knocking, Hana silently counted to 30, as Keiko required. Finally, from the other side, Keiko's voice granted permission. You may come in. Hana slowly opened the door to reveal a cramped, pitch-dark room. Heavy curtains blocked out all light. Keiko sat silently on her bed. Hana kept her eyes lowered, careful not to make direct eye contact. She quietly gathered the dirty dishes from Keiko's table, then turned to leave. Out of curiosity, she tried to steal a glance at what Keiko was working on. Keiko had claimed she was creating a masterwork. She insisted she needed total darkness, complete silence, and full concentration. The family's role was to support her. When asked what this masterwork was, Keiko only said it would be something extraordinary, something that combined her body, her mind, and even her family. But she never explained further. Hana couldn't see anything in the dim room, so she quickly turned away, carried the dishes to the kitchen sink, and scrubbed them spotless. Keiko demanded the house remain immaculate. No dust, no dirty dishes, nothing out of place. It was one of her rules for the masterwork. As Hana finished, her brother Daisuke entered the kitchen. He told her it was time to go to the market for supplies, things Keiko said she needed for her work. Hana felt irritation boil up again. Everything revolved around Keiko. But she bit back her resentment and went with him. Daisuke had long since abandoned his own writing career to dedicate himself to supporting Keiko. Unlike Hana, who resented their sister, Daisuke seemed proud to be part of what he believed would become the greatest artistic creation in history. He didn't even know what this masterwork was, but Keiko sometimes gave him specific instructions. That day, she had requested surgical spirits, medical alcohol, and a book on palm reading, so Hana and Daisuke concealed their faces as they always did in public, hurried to the shops, and bought them. At home, they knocked, waited, and their elderly mother opened the door, unlocking 4 heavy deadbolts. Keiko insisted no family member carry keys, terrified someone could lose one and an outsider might intrude on her work. Hana set the bag outside Keiko's door. A thin arm slipped out, grabbed the bag, and vanished. 3 days later, on April 18, Hana overheard Daisuke talking quietly to Keiko through her closed door. This was normal. He often spent hours sitting outside, conversing with her like this. But that day, his words sounded strange. How can you? How only your soul? How? Hana set her book aside and crept closer. When Daisuke noticed her, both he and Keiko went silent. He shook his head, got up, and walked away. Curious, Hana pressed her ear against the door, but all she heard was the faint sound of Keiko shuffling deeper into the room, then silence. It reminded Hana of how far she and her sister had drifted, and once they had been inseparable. But 5 years earlier, in 2013, everything had fallen apart. That day, Keiko emerged from her room, and Hana offered to read her palm, something they'd done before, for fun. Keiko had a rare line across her palm called a simian crease, which palmists say can signal either brilliance or aggression. Joking, Hana suggested maybe that explained Keiko's temper at the supermarket that had recently gotten their family banned. Keiko snapped. Screaming, she called Hana stupid, insisting her line meant she was a visionary. Then she attacked Hana, beating her until Daisuke pulled her off. Concerned, their mother sent Keiko to a doctor. The doctor found no physical issue, but warned she was having a psychological breakdown and needed psychiatric care. Keiko refused treatment, blaming Hana. From then on, she left her room even less and imposed new rules: no phones, no television, no computers, 4 locks on the door, and even requiring the family to learn her invented language so no outsiders could understand them. By May, Hana noticed Keiko was eating less and less. Her dishes came back full. She was barely 90 pounds and just 4'11" fragile already. Hana once broke her silence to urge, Keiko, you need to eat. Keiko said nothing. Shortly after, Daisuke told Hana she wasn't allowed inside anymore. From then on, Keiko left her dishes outside the door at night, sneaking to the bathroom only when everyone slept. By August, Hana and Daisuke were buying more surgical spirits than ever. Keiko never returned the bottles. On August 18, Hana overheard Daisuke arguing with Keiko. She heard him shout, "I told you, your soul is not enough." Then silence. Daisuke went inside. For 15 minutes, Hana sat frozen in the kitchen. When he came out, he looked calm. He told Hana Keiko's masterwork was nearly complete, and now was the time the family would help. He led Hana to the store to buy even more surgical spirits. Back home, he entered Keiko's room alone with the bottles. Later, he told Hana that Keiko was ready to reconcile. Overjoyed, Hana sat at the door and poured her heart out, apologizing, begging for their bond again. For the first time in years, Keiko didn't bang or scream to shut her up. Hana felt heard. From then on, both Hana and Daisuke were allowed inside to rub surgical spirits over Keiko's frail body. Hana didn't understand, but she was so grateful to be included that she didn't question it. Day after day, they massaged her with the liquid, then sat outside her door, talking to her. For Hana, it felt like healing. On September 25, Hana decided to surprise her sister. After applying the alcohol with Daisuke, she went to the family piano and, trembling, played the Waltz of the Flowers, a piece inspired by love for a sister. She hoped Keiko would understand. She listened for anger, for pounding. There was none. Tears streamed down Hana's face, but then there was pounding. Not from Keiko's room, from the front door. Police. Dozens of officers, firefighters, and EMTs flooded the house. They opened every door until they reached Keiko's. When they opened it, they recoiled. Her sunken eyes, translucent skin, and skeletal body lay motionless on the bed. EMTs carried her out on a stretcher. The truth soon came out. Keiko had stopped eating in April, claiming her visionary soul alone could sustain her. By August, she was dead. When Daisuke yelled, "Your soul is not enough," it was because he realized she wasn't responding, yet instead of calling for help, he believed it was time for the family to assist in her masterwork. From then until September, Hana and Daisuke rubbed alcohol on her corpse daily, convinced it nourished her. In reality, it only preserved her, slowly mummifying her remains. The 3 family members were arrested for preventing a lawful burial. Autopsy suggested Keiko died of starvation, but the official cause could not be confirmed. The court later dropped charges, ruling the family too mentally unstable to stand trial. They hadn't accepted that Keiko was dead. They believed she was still alive, still creating her masterwork. To this day, they remain in that same cottage, their reality forever broken. In 2006, a man named Dave Murphy had just begun his career as a police officer in Salt Lake City, Utah. His first assignment was as a protective services officer, responsible for maintaining security at various county buildings. His very first posting was the Capitol City Theater, an old, elegant landmark dating back to the early 1900s. On his first day in early August, Dave reported to the theater and met his partner, Officer Morgan Matthews. From the start, Dave noticed Morgan was all business, no small talk, strictly focused on the job. The first stop was the control room on the first floor, where monitors displayed the building's security feeds. The theater had 3 floors plus a basement, and while cameras were installed throughout, the footage was grainy and almost useless at night unless lights were on. After showing Dave the control room, Morgan explained they needed to do a full security sweep, something required at both the start and end of each shift. Together they moved through the building, checking every door and every light. When they descended into the basement, Dave was taken aback. The hallway stretched on endlessly, lined with doors, dimly lit, and right in the middle sat an old upright piano. The atmosphere instantly unsettled him. This place is creepy, he thought, hoping he wouldn't have to spend much time down there. Still, they finished their rounds through all floors, then returned to the control room. Dave tried to strike up conversation with Morgan during the shift, but Morgan kept distant, his demeanor almost cold. At the end of the night, Dave noticed how eager Morgan was to leave, practically rushing out the door. Something felt off. It was as though Morgan hated being in that theater. Dave didn't know it yet, but Morgan had good reason. For the next couple of days, while Dave was still training, the 2 men made their rounds together. But on August 9, only Dave's 3rd day, Morgan decided he was confident enough in Dave's ability to secure the building alone. So that night, Dave set off to do the full sweep by himself. Basement cleared, doors locked, lights off. First floor checked, main auditorium inspected. Second floor, fine. Finally, the third floor, he moved from office to office until he reached the last stop, the rehearsal room. It was the only space without a door. You simply poked your head in, turned on the light, scanned the room, then switched it off again. Dave flicked the light, looked inside, empty. Satisfied, he shut it off and stepped back into the hall. That's when it happened. From directly across the corridor came the deafening slam of a door, the bathroom door. Dave froze, adrenaline surging. His immediate thought was that someone had been hiding in there and had bolted. He raised his radio. Someone's on the third floor. Morgan checked the cameras but saw no one. Gun drawn, Dave held his aim on the hallway, waiting for backup. Then he realized something chilling. The person might not have left at all. They could still be inside the bathroom. And a second thought struck him. Those doors weren't capable of slamming shut. They were fitted with hydraulic closers that prevented them from doing so. When Morgan arrived, both officers leveled their weapons at the bathroom door and burst inside. Every stall, every corner clear, no one was there, and there was no possible exit. Still on edge, they decided the intruder must have slipped away and started a full search of the building. On the second floor, they discovered every light blazing and every door wide open, despite the fact Dave had turned them all off and locked them earlier. Yet once again, room by room, they found nothing. Eventually, they gave up, chalking it up to nerves. But both men left uneasy. 2 nights later, August 11, Morgan was on duty alone. Sitting in the control room, he heard whispers just behind him. Startled, he drew his pistol and stepped into the hallway. The whispers retreated ahead of him, drifting toward the stairwell. At the top of the stairs, he paused, listening. From the basement below came the sound of coughing. His heart pounded as he crept downward. Halfway down, the coughing abruptly stopped. He flipped the lights, swept the hallway empty. As he moved through, checking doors, he suddenly smelled smoke. He unlocked a nearby room, expecting fire, but there was none, only the odor. He searched every space, again and again, but found nothing. Eventually, the smell dissipated. Uneasy, but with no evidence, he let it go. Weeks later, on September 4, Dave arrived early for his shift. Inside the lobby, he overheard staff talking about ghosts. Intrigued, he introduced himself, and one of them, a senior accountant named Blair Fuller, offered a story. Blair recalled a late night a couple of years earlier. Alone in his office on the third floor, he heard the elevator machinery start up. He remembered thinking this was odd, since he was the only one there. He looked out his office window, watching as the elevator rose. Basement, first, second, third. The doors opened, empty. Moments later, the alarm sounded as if something blocked the doors, but nothing was in the way. Curious, Blair stepped into the elevator. The air was suddenly frigid. He turned to look back toward his office just as the doors closed on their own. Without him pressing anything, the basement button lit up. When the doors opened at the basement, the hall stretched away into darkness, the lone piano faintly visible. Mustering courage, Blair called out, but silence answered. He quickly retreated to his office. Minutes later, loud bangs echoed outside. He opened his door and saw a massive filing cabinet in the foyer, its drawers slamming shut one by one as though invisible hands were closing them. Terrified, Blair left and never worked another night shift. When Dave told Morgan this story, Morgan finally opened up. He admitted he'd always felt watched inside the theater, long before Dave arrived. He confessed about hearing voices, coughing, and smelling phantom smoke. Both men agreed the place was unnatural. To test their suspicions, Dave invited his best friend Greg for a tour. While walking through the basement, they spotted a door ajar. Weapons drawn, Dave and Morgan advanced, Greg trailing nervously behind. Before they reached it, the door slammed shut in their faces. Then the handle began rattling violently. Steeling themselves, they forced the door open, swept inside empty. That's when Greg gasped, pointing into a corner. "There's someone sitting there!" he cried. But the officers saw nothing. Shaken, the three quickly abandoned the basement. The county responded by installing new cameras with infrared to catch the supposed intruder. On September 15, Morgan was alone scanning the feeds when he spotted something disturbing. In the auditorium, a dark figure sat in one of the seats. He leaned closer as the figure lifted its head, eyes glinting. Then, before his eyes, it rose straight into the air and vanished. Morgan quit that very night. Weeks later, Dave was working alone when piano music echoed from the basement. Gripping his pistol, he descended. The music grew louder until suddenly it stopped, the protective cover over the keys slamming shut. Dave found the piano untouched, the basement empty. That was the last straw. He demanded reassignment, refusing ever to set foot in the theater again. For a time, security was handled by rotating officers. Then, in late November, a veteran named Josh Thomas took over full-time. On his very first night, he called for backup, claiming the elevator had mysteriously risen from the basement and opened on the third floor with no one inside. Dave, nearby in his patrol car, reluctantly responded. Inside the auditorium, while the two men talked on stage, Josh suddenly froze, eyes locked over Dave's shoulder. Dave turned. At the very back stood a hooded figure, its face hidden. As they stared, it spun around, revealing charred, blackened skin and deep, hollow eyes, then bolted into the darkness. They searched but found nothing. Later research uncovered that in the 1940s, a devastating fire had swept the theater. A man trapped in the basement had perished. Dave, Morgan, and Josh all came to believe the entity they encountered was that man's restless spirit. In the summer of 1906, Dr. William Clark, a successful oncologist from New York City, and his wife Harriet were driving through Litchfield County in northwestern Connecticut. Their lives in the city were busy and glamorous. Between William's thriving career and their constant social obligations, they rarely had peace. So, they had decided to look for a second home in the countryside, a retreat away from the chaos. As they drove along winding country roads, they crossed a red wooden bridge, and when they came out on the other side, their view opened up to rolling hills and dense green forest. What caught their attention was a particular hillside in the distance that looked unusually dark, shaded by two mountains on either side, almost like a hidden valley. The place was beautiful but oddly mysterious. Locals called it Dark Entry Forest. Intrigued, the couple noticed a narrow access road leading toward it. They decided to follow. The deeper they drove, the more overgrown the path became, until eventually they had to park the car and continue on foot. Walking into the thick canopy, it was as if they'd stepped into another world. The light dimmed, the air cooled, and an almost magical silence wrapped around them. Inside, the forest was stunning. Wild apple orchards, heavy with fruit, deer grazing without fear, meadows bursting with flowers, and streams sparkling where sunlight broke through. The ground shimmered with flecks of mica, a mineral that glinted like tiny shards of glass. To the Clarks, it felt like something out of a fairy tale. Within an hour, they were convinced this was where they would build their summer retreat. They purchased 10 acres of dark entry forest, intending only to build a modest cabin. But when Dr. Clark approached local builders, none of them would take the job. They never gave a clear reason, only excuses, always refusing to set foot in that forest. Unbothered, Dr. Clark decided to do it himself. On weekends, he traveled alone into Dark Entry, where owls seemed to greet him each time with haunting calls. Over several months, he cleared land, felled hemlock trees, milled them into lumber, and eventually built a rustic two-story cabin. He even laid piping from a nearby freshwater spring and constructed a pool beside a brook full of trout. By Thanksgiving of 1906, the cabin was complete. For years, the Clark family returned each summer and every holiday, finding peace in their secluded woodland retreat. It was idyllic until 1918. That summer, Dr. Clark was called unexpectedly back to New York for an urgent case. Harriet chose to stay at the cabin alone, uneasy but confident she would be safe. William promised to return within a couple of days. In reality, he was gone for only 36 hours. When he returned by train, Harriet wasn't waiting at the station. Concern growing, he walked the familiar path toward the forest. But as he stepped under the canopy, everything felt different. The owl's calls, once charming, now sounded menacing, almost as if warning him to turn back. The deeper he went, the louder and more chaotic the hooting became, until it was nearly deafening. Panicked, he hurried up the hill toward the cabin. The front door was ajar. Bursting inside, he immediately sensed something was horribly wrong. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive, until a high-pitched, manic laughter echoed from upstairs. Heart pounding, Dr. Clark ran up to the bedroom. The door was slightly open, and the laughter poured out from within. Pushing it wide, he froze. In the corner was Harriet, curled into a ball. Her jaw was unnaturally stretched open, though her mouth didn't move. The horrifying laughter was pouring out of her as her chest heaved and her wide eyes locked on him. Terrified beyond words, Dr. Clark fled. Harriet was later removed from the cabin, muttering only about the strange creatures she had seen outside, creatures she insisted that kept returning. It was the same claim that many of Dudleytown's former residents had made before the village collapsed into ruin. Because here's what the Clarks never knew. Dark Entry Forest had once been home to a small settlement called Dudleytown, founded in the 1740s. At first, it thrived. But by the late 1700s, tragedy struck family after family. Disease, sudden deaths, bizarre accidents, madness, and strange sightings of shadowy figures in the trees plagued the town. By 1900, every resident was gone, dead, vanished, or driven insane. The last survivor, John Brophy, watched his home burn to the ground before disappearing forever into the woods. From that day forward, Dudleytown was abandoned, its foundations left to crumble beneath the forest. Locals whispered it was cursed. What exactly happened to Harriet after that night is unclear. Some accounts say she spent the rest of her life in an asylum. Others claim she eventually returned to New York, where she ended her own life. What is certain is that she never recovered. In the years that followed, Dark Entry Forest gained a terrifying reputation. Visitors reported icy blasts of air, phantom hands striking them, and overwhelming feelings of dread. Paranormal investigators Ed and Lorraine Warren even declared it a site of demonic presence. Today, entry to the forest is forbidden, strictly off-limits, but stories still circulate. Tales of shadows that move on their own, owls that seem to mock intruders, and laughter, unnatural, high-pitched laughter echoing among the ruins of Dudleytown. On the evening of the 13th of January, 2002, 42-year-old Ronald Huff came back to his Newark, Delaware studio apartment after visiting his grandmother. As soon as he walked inside, he felt terrible. The place was sweltering, but Ronald preferred it that way. He always kept the heat blasting. He tossed his coat over one of the handmade wooden cages scattered across his living room, then staggered toward the phone. Fighting a wave of dizziness, he dialed the auto dealership where he worked and told the office manager he was too sick to come in the next day. When he hung up, he leaned against the counter to steady himself. From behind, a sharp hiss cut through the silence. Without hesitation, Ronald moved to the fridge. Out of habit, he grabbed the handle with his right hand, instantly wincing in pain. That hand was bandaged from an earlier injury. Gritting his teeth, he switched to his left hand and tugged the door open. After shutting it again, he went over to the counter, reached into a jar, and pulled out a squirming handful of 2-inch live cockroaches. He dropped them on the floor, watching them scatter in every direction. It was just part of his nightly routine. Feeling weak, Ronald decided he should lie down. But as he crossed the kitchen, the dizziness returned with brutal force. The room spun. He tried to push through it, aiming for his bedroom, but his legs buckled. Stumbling sideways, he crashed against his apartment door, braced himself for a moment, then slowly slid down with his back against the wood, legs stretched in front of him. His eyelids sank shut, and the last thing he heard before slipping into unconsciousness was the sound of roaches skittering and the crunch of bones being chewed. 3 days later, one of Ronald's neighbors heard police radios crackling outside in the hall. Curious, he opened his door and saw 2 officers with the building superintendent standing outside Ronald's apartment. The neighbor liked Ronald. He was a quiet, polite guy, so it didn't make sense why cops would be there. Then again, he realized he hadn't seen Ronald for several days. The officers knocked repeatedly. No response. After a few minutes, they had the superintendent use his master key. But even then, when they tried to push the door open, it barely budged. Something heavy was blocking it. Both men leaned their weight against the door until it finally cracked open just enough to peek inside. What they saw made both officers recoil, hands instinctively moving to their guns. One frantically radioed for backup. Then, without a word, the two officers and the superintendent hurried down the hall, leaving the door slightly ajar. The neighbor, frozen in shock, could see into Ronald's apartment from his own doorway. What he saw inside made his blood run cold. His body locked up for a second, then he slammed his own door shut in horror. Hours later, he still couldn't shake the image. To get it out of his head, he grabbed a piece of paper and started sketching what he had seen. The truth was, Ronald had a secret, and that secret killed him. The neighbor's sketch showed Ronald's lifeless body lying on the floor, his face, ears, hands, and even his organs partially eaten. Surrounding him were enormous reptiles, monitor lizards that Ronald had secretly been raising inside his apartment, 7 of them. He fed them raw chicken and live roaches and let them freely roam his home. They ranged from 2 feet to 6 feet long, massive carnivorous predators with mouths full of dangerous bacteria. A week before Ronald's death, one of the lizards bit his right hand, leaving him with a severe staph infection. That infection almost certainly caused him to collapse the night he called in sick. When he lost consciousness, the lizards did what came naturally: they attacked. Authorities believe Ronald died from the infection itself, but they couldn't rule out that he might have still been alive when the lizards began feeding. After his death, the animals were removed and transferred to a wildlife preserve in Maryland. But the horrifying way Ronald died, consumed by his own pets, became one of the most chilling and bizarre cases in Delaware's history. In the early 2000s, a teenager named Ebon often went hunting with his father in the deep backcountry of Georgia. By the time he turned 14, his father had befriended a wealthy landowner who generously offered them access to one of his private hunting reserves, a place few others had ever set foot in. It was an incredible opportunity, and just a few days later, on October 5th, the two of them drove out to try it. They set out before dawn, arriving at a locked gate that marked the boundary of the property. Using the code the landowner had provided, they let themselves in, relocked the gate behind them, and followed a dirt access road for about 2 miles before it ended at the edge of a vast forest. Parking their truck, they geared up and hiked into the trees under cover of near total darkness. Although they were there to hunt, both Eban and his father loved simply being in the woods, camping and hiking together, but almost immediately they noticed something strange about this forest. It was too quiet. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, nothing. The silence was so absolute that the only break in it was the distant drone of a single airplane overhead. Still, they brushed it off, assuming that maybe the wildlife had been spooked by their arrival. They continued to the hunting stand that the landowner had recommended and settled in. But as the hours crawled by, nothing stirred. No deer, no turkeys, not even squirrels. Just an eerie, oppressive stillness that lasted all day. Frustrated, they climbed down from the stand as dusk approached and began looking for a place to camp. Ebon's father suggested they head deeper into the woods. Maybe further in, the game will be better. So they hiked for another hour before finding a clearing that seemed perfect for their tent. After setting up, Eban's father suggested they try one last time to hunt before nightfall. They left their camp and set up a blind a short distance away, but again, nothing appeared. No sound, no movement, just silence. Disappointed, they finally turned back toward camp. As soon as their tent came into view, both stopped in their tracks. It had collapsed. Eban's father muttered, "Must have been the wind," but Eban shook his head. "No way. We've been saying all day, there's no wind. It's dead quiet." His father frowned, then asked if maybe Eban had assembled it wrong. But Eban insisted he knew exactly what he was doing. He had pitched the same tent countless times. When they reached the tent, the explanation became even less convincing. The 2 support rods that crossed in an X over the top had been removed from all 4 anchor points. The only ways that could happen were if the rods broke or if someone deliberately pulled them free. Yet none of the rods were broken, and neither of them had touched the tent after setting it up. The unsettling implication was obvious. Someone or something had been in their camp while they were gone. But the landowner had assured them this was private, fenced-in property. No one else had access. Trying to keep calm, they convinced themselves they must have somehow botched the setup, even though neither really believed it. They rebuilt the tent, lit a small fire, and tried to relax. After a while, they doused the flames and went to bed. Hours later, Ebon woke with a start. At first, he wasn't sure if he had dreamed it, but he thought he'd heard laughter somewhere out in the woods. Instinctively, he turned to check if his father was still beside him, and he was. Relieved, Ebon lay still, straining his ears. The forest was silent again. Eventually, he told himself it must have been his imagination and drifted back to sleep. But not long after, he woke again. This time, his father was already awake, sitting up and listening intently. When Eben asked what was wrong, his father shushed him. "Do you hear that?" And Eben did. Faint, echoing through the trees, was laughter, unnatural, unsettling. Worse, it was coming from the opposite direction he'd heard it earlier, and it sounded much closer now. Ebon whispered to his father that he had heard it before, and his father looked grim. He admitted that before their trip, he had asked the landowner whether anyone else would be on the property. The man had been adamant the place was completely private, fully fenced, and under surveillance. They were the only ones there. As they sat in tense silence, the laughter suddenly stopped. Then came the sound of rapid footsteps charging toward their camp from deep in the forest. The sound was unmistakable on the silent ground, growing louder and faster until it halted abruptly right at the edge of their clearing. Ebon clutched his father's arm. His father gripped his rifle, steeling himself to unzip the tent and confront whatever was out there. But just as he reached for the zipper, the laughter erupted again, this time so loud and so close, it was practically in their ears, right outside the thin fabric walls. Heart pounding, Eben's father froze, holding the zipper halfway down. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the laughter cut off. No footsteps retreating, no sound at all. It was as if the presence outside was silently listening, waiting. For long minutes, neither of them moved, barely breathing. Finally, the sound of running footsteps tore through the woods again, retreating into the distance until the forest was silent once more. They sat in terrified silence for the rest of the night, too afraid to speak or make a sound, convinced that whatever was out there had heard them when they unzipped the tent. They clutched their guns and waited, counting down the hours until daylight. As soon as the first light broke through the trees, they bolted from the tent, packed their gear as fast as they could, and ran the entire way back to their truck, glancing over their shoulders the whole time. To this day, they have no explanation for what stalked them that night, and when they told the landowner, he flatly insisted it was impossible. His cameras had shown no one else entering or leaving the property during the time they were there. On the morning of September 15, 2010, a 55-year-old man named Greg Flanagan checked into the Elegante Hotel in Beaumont, Texas, where his company always lodged him during the work week. Years earlier, Greg had been a chief engineer on ocean-going vessels, spending months at sea. In midlife, though, he reinvented himself as a landman, someone who negotiated mineral rights and drilling leases. Despite his chain smoking and poor diet, he looked lean and fit, with weathered skin and a neatly trimmed white beard, the appearance of a man who had spent his life outdoors. Every Monday, Greg would drive 2 hours from his home in Lafayette, Louisiana, to Beaumont. Once checked in, his habits were predictable. He didn't drink, didn't socialize, rarely left his room. All he needed was a bed, a TV, and cold air conditioning. His room was basic: a bathroom by the door, a queen bed tucked to the right, a small desk and TV opposite, and a window that overlooked a little swimming pool lined with potted plants. He set his suitcase at the foot of the bed, hung a few shirts in the closet, hooked his toiletry bag on the towel rack, and changed into pajama pants. Greg's evening ritual was simple. He'd crank the air conditioner as low as it would go, prop 2 pillows behind his head, and set up a towel on the bedspread with everything he needed within reach: an ashtray, his cigarettes and lighter, a candy bar, his phone, and the TV remote. That night, he flipped channels until he landed on Iron Man 2. Good enough, he thought, as he unwrapped the candy bar, ate a piece, and lit a cigarette. The next morning, his wife Susie didn't get his usual call. Greg phoned her every morning without fail. When repeated calls went unanswered, she rang his office, only to hear that he hadn't shown up. Alarmed, she asked a couple of his coworkers to check on him at the hotel. When they knocked on his door, there was no response. They fetched the manager, who unlocked the room. What they found inside made them stagger back. Greg was lying face down in the middle of the room, his body twisted as if he'd collapsed mid-stride. His left arm was pinned beneath him, 2 fingers still clutching a burnt-down cigarette. The room was stifling hot, and Greg's skin had taken on a bluish-gray tint. Detective Scott Apple was called to the scene. Short, silver-haired, muscular, he looked every bit the career cop. As he surveyed the room, nothing suggested foul play. No signs of forced entry, no struggle, no theft. Greg's wallet was still stuffed with cash. The only marks on him were a scrape on his cheek from the fall and a small abrasion in his groin. To Apple, it looked like a natural death. When Susie was notified, she told Apple her husband had been a lifelong smoker, ate terribly, and never saw a doctor. She had always worried he'd keel over from a heart attack. Apple nodded, convinced it was the most likely explanation. Greg's body was sent to Dr. Tommy Brown, the local medical examiner. At first glance, the theory fit a middle-aged man with bad habits, no obvious wounds, found collapsed in a hotel room. But once Dr. Brown opened him up, the case took a bizarre turn. Inside Greg's torso was devastation. Broken ribs, torn organs, his heart punctured, his abdominal cavity filled with blood. It was the kind of trauma seen in car crash victims or people crushed by massive weight. But there were no external injuries, no bruises, nothing to suggest blunt force. Stunned, Dr. Brown declared it a homicide, likely the result of a beating, though he admitted the evidence didn't quite make sense. Apple was baffled. He dug into Greg's background, hoping to find a motive, but everyone described Greg as polite, kind, happily married, with no enemies. There was no affair, no financial trouble, no hint of scandal. He was a quiet man who worked, called his wife, smoked his cigarettes, and kept to himself. With nowhere to go, Apple scrutinized hotel records. One oddity emerged. The night Greg died, he had tripped a breaker while making popcorn in the microwave. That power outage knocked electricity out, not just in his room, but in the 2 rooms beside it and the one directly below. Maintenance logs showed a staff member restored the power around 8:30 p.m. Apple considered 2 theories. One, the maintenance man who had a criminal record attacked Greg. But there was no evidence. 2, Greg's neighbors in room 349, 2 electricians known to drink and party, confronted him after losing power and beat him. But when Apple interviewed them, they seemed cooperative, even concerned, and offered their phone numbers to help further. Neither theory stuck. Months passed, the case stalled, and eventually it went cold. Then, 7 months later, Susie hired a private investigator. Ken Brennan, a former DEA agent and Long Island cop with a reputation for cracking unsolvable cases. Brennan flew to Louisiana, grilled Susie about her marriage, then went to Texas to meet Apple. Apple handed over the case files. Brennan spent the night studying them. The next day, he told Apple he had it figured out. Apple rolled his eyes. He'd been stuck for months. But Brennan was serious. He asked Susie one question over the phone. Did Greg ever smoke with his left hand? She answered no, only his right. That was all Brennan needed. Here was his theory. Greg had been watching TV, smoking with his right hand, when something catastrophic happened. He jumped off the bed, switched the cigarette to his left hand so he could grab the doorknob with his right, and collapsed before reaching it. But what caused him to leap up? Brennan believed Greg had been shot. Apple was skeptical. There was no bullet wound. But Brennan brought him back to the hotel room, pointing to a patched spot on the wall. He argued it wasn't from the doorknob, as Apple thought. They went next door into room 349. Brennan ran his hands along the wall until his finger pushed into a tiny plug of toothpaste stuffed into a hole. Crime scene investigators later confirmed it, a bullet hole lined up perfectly with where Greg had been sitting in bed. Looking back at autopsy photos, that abrasion in his groin was a small entry wound. The hole in his heart lined up with the bullet's path. Greg had been shot through the wall. Re-interviewed, one of the electricians cracked. He admitted that his coworker, Muller, had been fooling around with a pistol in their room. Drunk, he'd pointed it at his friend, dropped it, and the gun went off. The bullet blasted through the wall into Greg's room, striking him fatally. Panicked, they heard nothing at first and assumed the room was empty. When they later returned and heard Greg coughing, they convinced themselves he was fine. The next day, when they saw police assuming natural causes, they stayed quiet and plugged the hole with toothpaste. Muller was charged with manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years. Greg's mysterious internal crushing turned out not to be a beating or a medical condition at all, but the silent path of a stray bullet fired recklessly in the room next door. From the time Gareth Williams was just a kid, it was clear he was extraordinary. At 17 years old, he had already earned a first-class mathematics degree from a university near his home in Wales. Within a couple of years, he had his PhD from the University of Manchester. Soon after, he began postgraduate work at Cambridge, one of the world's most elite schools, but he never finished. His brilliance had caught the attention of Britain's intelligence services. In 2001, at just 23, Gareth accepted a position at GCHQ, Britain's secretive government communications headquarters. There, he worked as a codebreaker, a job he excelled at. Despite being intensely private and almost painfully shy, Gareth's contributions were so important that his team won Britain's highest honors for international code-breaking. In 2009, another agency came calling, MI6, the Secret Intelligence Service. They offered Gareth something few codebreakers ever get the chance to go operational. This was the kind of work you'd expect from a Hollywood spy. Field assignments, intelligence gathering, real cloak and dagger work. To many, it was a dream job. Gareth took it, but within months, he regretted it. MI6 was nothing like GCHQ. The culture was competitive, flashy, and social expensive cars, hard partying, long hours. Gareth wanted no part of it. He simply wanted to do the work and be left alone. At GCHQ, that was fine. At MI6, it made him an outsider. After less than a year, Gareth was planning to leave. In August of 2010, Gareth went on vacation. When the time came to return, he didn't show up at his London office. Oddly, no one from MI6 bothered to check in on him. Days passed without contact. It wasn't until Gareth's sister called the police, worried she hadn't heard from him, that anyone went to his flat. On August 23rd, a uniformed officer arrived at his Pimlico apartment for a welfare check. After knocking and getting no answer, the landlord provided a key. Inside, the officer called Gareth's name. No response. The first floor was empty, so he climbed the stairs. At the top was a closed door. When he pushed it open, what he saw would dominate international headlines for weeks. The bathroom was ordinary, except for the red duffel bag sitting in the bathtub. Inside that bag was the decomposing body of Gareth Williams. The bag had been padlocked shut from the outside. The key was found inside the bag, underneath Gareth's body. There were no fingerprints anywhere, not on the tub, not on the zippers, not on the padlock, not even on the keys. Gareth's iPhone was found nearby. It had been factory reset on August 15th, the same day Gareth was last seen alive on CCTV footage. Investigators concluded he had likely died that very day. The coroner's report was baffling. Gareth's body bore no signs of trauma, no defensive wounds, and toxicology tests showed no alcohol or drugs. The heat inside the apartment, the thermostat, had been cranked up despite it being August, sped up decomposition, making cause of death impossible to determine. So what happened? Theories exploded. Some suspected the Russian mafia. In the weeks before his death, Gareth had been working on cases linked to Russian money laundering, a dangerous assignment that could easily have made him a target. Others suspected MI6 itself. Why hadn't anyone checked on Gareth when he didn't return from holiday? Former intelligence officers publicly claimed MI6 may have staged a cover-up, cleaning the flat of fingerprints and evidence before police arrived. Then there was the more sensational theory that Gareth's death was an accident tied to personal interests. Investigators learned he had occasionally browsed bondage websites. Once his landlord had to help him untie himself after he bound his wrists to a bed frame, could Gareth have locked himself inside the bag as part of some bizarre experiment or fetish? Two experts tried to replicate it. Over 400 attempts later, neither could successfully climb inside and lock the padlock from the outside. Even if Gareth somehow managed it, there was still the glaring problem: how did he do it without leaving a single fingerprint anywhere? Despite glaring red flags, in 2013, the official verdict was that Gareth's death was probably accidental. The case was closed. But to this day, many believe the truth of what happened to Gareth Williams, the brilliant codebreaker found zipped and locked inside a duffel bag, remains buried deep within the walls of British intelligence. From a young age, Pauline Day always had a nagging sense that something about her family didn't quite add up. Years later, she would find out her instincts were right. Back in 1970, when Pauline was just 5, her parents, Ruth and Warren, separated. To Pauline, it wasn't exactly shocking. Her father drank heavily and was violent, so the split almost felt inevitable. Afterward, Pauline, her mother, and her brother moved across Vancouver into a new house. That's when Pauline began noticing her mother seemed perpetually anxious, though she never explained why. By the time Pauline turned 9, her mother suddenly announced they were going on vacation to Winnipeg, nearly 1,000 miles away. But when they arrived, Ruth told her children the truth. They weren't going back. Vancouver and their father were gone for good. Pauline and her brother were devastated, but Ruth insisted it was necessary. Over the next few years in Winnipeg, Pauline built a small circle of friends. Just as life was beginning to feel normal, Ruth uprooted the family again. This time, she said they were moving clear across the country to New Brunswick, and they were forbidden from telling anyone. Pauline slipped once, mentioning it to her best friend Wendy, and when Ruth picked her up, the two girls had to pretend everything was fine. It was the last goodbye they'd ever share. In New Brunswick, the family finally seemed to settle down. They stayed for years, but Ruth's nerves never eased. Pauline grew up, moved a couple of hours away, and by her early 20s was working as a reporter. Then in 1988, her mother called with a cryptic request: "Meet me at a motel. It's time I told you everything." Pauline was eager. This was the conversation she'd been waiting for her whole life. But when she arrived, Ruth was pacing outside, jittery. Before Pauline could speak, her mother pressed a finger to her lips, handed her an envelope, and whispered, "Take off your jewelry, put it in here." It's probably bugged. Confused but obedient, Pauline slipped off her rings and necklace, sealed them in the envelope, and followed Ruth into the room. Inside was a man Pauline recognized instantly: Reverend Stan Sears, the minister from their old church in Vancouver. Ruth had worked as his secretary years ago. Pauline had seen him pop up occasionally in Winnipeg and New Brunswick too, but never understood why. Now, Ruth explained. She and Stan had secretly been in love since Vancouver, carrying on a relationship all those years. That revelation was shocking enough, but what came next left Pauline reeling. According to her mother, Warren, Pauline's father, wasn't just abusive. He was allegedly a mobster in a Vancouver crime syndicate. When Ruth left him, she claimed the mob marked her for death, believing she knew too much. Stan, too, was supposedly targeted after counseling a man connected to organized crime. To protect themselves, Ruth said, they had fled Vancouver, moving from city to city under constant threat. Pauline was floored. For once, all the unexplained paranoia seemed to make sense. The sudden moves, the whispered warnings, the odd rituals, like her mother throwing out all the food without reason. Ruth explained it was because they'd been told the mob tried to poison them. Even Pauline's abrupt school changes were, in Ruth's telling, because the mob had discovered where she was enrolled. As the hours passed, Pauline listened, stunned. By the end, her mother revealed the final twist. After years in hiding, she and Stan had contacted authorities and entered a special witness protection program, which they called the Weird World. Agents, she said, were monitoring them constantly. Ruth handed Pauline a radio that supposedly connected directly to those agents and told her it should only be used in emergencies. To drive the point home, Stan rushed out to her car before she left, pressing a GPS transponder into her hand. "Hide this under your car," he said. "It'll let the agents track you." Pauline left the motel overwhelmed. But for a while, she went along. She ended her relationship, quit her job, and moved apartments. The paranoia had sunk in. Eventually, she called her mother and begged to officially join this so-called weird world. Ruth and Stan seemed thrilled, but told her it would take time. But as Pauline confided in her new boyfriend Kevin, who would later become her husband, she began doubting. Was this story even true? Could her father really have been a mobster? Were they actually in hiding all those years? To test it, Pauline staged a trap. She phoned her mother in a panic and claimed the mob had broken into her apartment. Ruth told her not to call police and said she would check with Stan. Minutes later, Ruth called back saying agents had confirmed 2 mobsters had indeed been arrested trying to break into Pauline's home and that she was safe now. But Pauline knew it was a lie. She had made the whole thing up. No one had broken in. That was the moment the truth crashed down. Her mother and Stan weren't in witness protection. Her father wasn't a mobster. There was no mafia plot. Instead, Stan suffered from a psychological condition called delusional disorder, one fixed false belief. His happened to be that the mob was after him. Through shared psychosis folie à he passed this delusion to Ruth. Together, they spun the elaborate story and lived it for decades. Even when Pauline confronted them, neither admitted the truth. They went to their graves, convinced the mafia was after them. Pauline never received an apology, never had her mother acknowledge reality. Their biggest fear was that Pauline herself would now be vulnerable because she didn't use the transponder or the radio. Ultimately, Pauline found peace in telling her story. She wrote a best-selling memoir, Run, Hide, Repeat, where she laid bare the decades of deception and paranoia that shaped her life. Case 1. The disappearance of Jeannie Hesselschwart. In 1995, 37-year-old Jeannie Hesselschwart lived in Arlington, Massachusetts with her fiancé, Mike Monahan. They had been together for a decade, and their families described them as deeply in love and devoted to each other. That summer, in July, they planned a backpacking and sightseeing trip to Yosemite National Park in California. On July 9, the couple entered Yosemite by a seasonal road that was only open in summer. It was quiet and desolate, no traffic, no people, and the drive itself would take 2 hours before reaching their destination. Roughly 2 hours in, they came to a scenic turnout where a handful of tourists were gathered admiring the view. Jeannie and Mike decided to stop, stretch their legs, and look around. Mike mentioned he wanted to head down a short path that was said to be good for bird watching. Jeannie, on the other hand, wanted to walk the opposite direction toward an overlook. They agreed to split up, each taking 15 minutes before meeting back at the car. Mike finished his short walk, returned as planned, but Jeannie never showed. At first, he waited, then asked the nearby tourists if they'd seen her. No one had. Growing anxious, he wandered a little up the trail she had taken, but quickly realized it branched off in several directions. Not knowing where she went, he hurried back. Spotting a park employee collecting trash, he begged for help. Within 45 minutes, rangers were on the scene. What followed became Yosemite's largest search and rescue operation at the time. 40 square miles covered by helicopters, dogs, rangers, and hundreds of volunteers. Yet no trace of Jeannie was found. After 2 weeks, the only clues were 2 boot prints believed to be hers, one near the turnout, and another oddly placed crossing a major trail instead of following it. For searchers, this was baffling. Why would a lost hiker ignore a clear trail that led back to civilization? Dog teams brought to the area couldn't track her scent at all. Some handlers even suspected Mike was lying and that Jeannie had never been there. The FBI got involved, polygraphed Mike, and cleared him completely. 2 months later, on September 3, 2 fishermen in a remote section of the park discovered her body in a pool of water 3 miles from the turnout where she vanished. She wore only socks and a single boot. She had been submerged long enough that no cause of death could be determined. At first, it was speculated she might have fallen into a river upstream and been carried down. But officials pointed out the waterway was filled with debris. Her body couldn't have drifted that far. That left 2 possibilities. She had somehow climbed down 0 feet of sheer cliff without gear, or someone had carried her. Neither seemed realistic. A tracker later suggested Jeannie may have mistaken the rustling of aspen leaves for the sound of traffic on a road. Panicked, she might have walked toward the sound, even crossing over a trail in the process, ultimately leading her to a dangerous cliffside where she fell. But officials doubted this too. Reaching the exact pool where she was found would have required not just falling, but practically leaping. To this day, no definitive explanation exists. Case 2, Amy Linkert and Joe Blasley, Craters of the Moon. On September 19, 2013, 69-year-old retired teacher Amy Linkert and her friend, 63-year-old physician Joe Blasley, left for a short trip to Craters of the Moon National Monument in Idaho. The park is a dormant volcanic field covered in sharp lava flows, massive craters, and riddled with more than 100 miles of lava tubes beneath the surface. They told family they'd return by the 21st, but when that day came and went with no word, relatives grew worried. By the 23rd, authorities were contacted. The women's pickup truck was soon located in the park's lot. Inside were their purses, phones, and most concerning, their 2 beloved dogs, alive but abandoned. Their families insisted this was unthinkable. The women adored their pets and would never leave them. The search escalated immediately. Helicopters scanned from above while teams scoured the rough terrain. Within a day, Amy's body was discovered far off any trail in an extremely rugged, inaccessible area. Park officials were stunned. This wasn't somewhere casual visitors could stumble into, especially not 2 older women out for a light hike. For weeks, teams searched for Joe. Cadaver dogs scoured the lava fields. Pilots flew repeated sweeps overhead. Nothing. Finally, on October 23, nearly a month after Amy was found, Joe's body surfaced 1 mile away in another equally treacherous remote spot. Neither woman showed signs of major trauma, and no incapacitating injuries were reported. The official ruling, accidental deaths. But the questions remain. Why did they leave their dogs and phones in the car? Why would they stray so far into lethal terrain? And how did Joe's body end up in an area that had already been heavily searched by both air crews and dogs? Theories of foul play linger, but without proof, the mystery remains. Case 3, Mark Hansen on the Appalachian Trail. On March 7, 1975, 21-year-old college student Mark Hansen set out with 2 friends, Ben Fish and John Chittister, to hike the Appalachian Trail during their spring break. All 3 were fit and eager to test themselves on one of the trail's toughest sections. The weather, however, was terrible cold, rain, and snow forecasted. John quickly realized the conditions were too much and turned back. Mark and Ben pushed forward, determined to prove themselves. The hike was brutal. Uphill climbs, freezing rain, heavy packs. Ben managed well, but Mark struggled, lagging behind, exhausted. By evening, they still hadn't reached the Tri-Corner Knob shelter where they planned to sleep. As snow began to fall, Mark collapsed onto the trail, insisting he could go no further. Ben begged him to push on, but Mark refused. So Ben walked ahead to scout for the shelter, unaware he was only about 200 meters from it. Missing it in the dark, he returned and set up nearby, deciding to camp within sight of Mark. That night, Ben had a nightmare of Mark screaming for help as something dragged him into the forest. When Ben awoke, Mark was gone. Only his backpack remained. Fresh snow had covered any tracks. Panicked, Ben rushed down the trail and stumbled upon the shelter so close they could have made it the night before. A massive search followed. Mark's pack still held his food, tent, and warm clothes. For over a week, rescuers scoured the area. Rangers found a large cave nearby filled with animal bones, evidence of a predator, possibly a bear. On the 9th day, Mark's body was found 3 miles downhill, propped against a tree. His gloves, boots, and jacket were off and neatly placed beside him. The autopsy suggested he died 36 hours after leaving the trail. But why did he leave? The trail was wide and obvious. Even in snow, it was nearly impossible to stray off accidentally. And Mark had been too weak hours earlier to even stand, yet somehow he traveled miles through rough terrain in the middle of the night. Was Ben's dream actually real? Did something attack Mark and drag him away? The truth remains unanswered. In April of 2020, a 17-year-old named Sam, an avid outdoorsman, decided to head out on a one-night backpacking trip in Arizona's Superstition Mountains. The origin of that name has several theories, but the most widely accepted is that people began avoiding the area due to the many unexplained deaths that had occurred there. Because so many feared mysterious death, the range was branded the Superstition Mountains. Sam, however, was not superstitious. He knew the terrain well and often hiked there, especially an 8-mile loop trail that cut through a canyon. His plan was straightforward: hike 4 miles in, camp overnight, and then hike 4 miles back the next day. Originally, he was supposed to have a friend with him, but at the last minute, his companion canceled. Sam hesitated, wondering if he should still go, but ultimately chose to do it solo since he was so familiar with the route. He had intended to start early to maximize daylight, but between delays, traffic, and rough road conditions, he didn't reach the trailhead until 5:45 p.m. That was far later than he wanted. He knew immediately this was a bad call, he'd be losing light fast, and there was almost no chance of making it to his planned 4-mile campsite before dark. Still, confident in his stamina, he figured he could at least push 2 or 3 miles in, where he knew there were decent clearings to camp. He decided to chance it. But progress was slower than expected. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving him in total darkness. His flashlight beam stretched barely 10 feet ahead, and at one point he nearly slipped off a rocky ledge, a fall that could have seriously injured him. That's when reality hit. He was 15 miles from the nearest help, in an area with poor cell reception, on treacherous roads, and no one knew his exact location. He realized continuing was reckless. He needed to stop immediately and camp right where he was. Luckily, just off the trail, he spotted a small clearing in the trees. Shining his light revealed an open space, and on its edge, he noticed the remains of an old fire pit. Someone had clearly camped here before and survived the night, which reassured him. He suddenly felt relieved, almost smart, for stumbling onto it. Sam didn't carry a tent. He preferred sleeping on a pad inside a sleeping bag with a tarp strung overhead in case of rain. The surrounding pines made it easy to rig his tarp. Soon he had a fire going, cracked open a can of beans, and settled in for dinner. For a while, everything felt perfect. But as he ate, a nagging unease set in. Something felt off. He found himself scanning the tree line, trying to spot anything unusual. But seated next to a fire in a dark forest meant his vision was limited to a tiny circle of light. Beyond that, it was nothing but blackness. He told himself it was just nerves. Yet, while rationalizing away the feeling, a marble-sized rock suddenly sailed out of the darkness and landed at his feet. Instant dread shot through him. The rock seemed to confirm his instincts. He wasn't alone. He quickly scanned the trees, straining his ears. For the next 15 minutes, he listened and watched, tense and ready. But nothing else happened. No more rocks, no footsteps. Slowly, he began calming down, convincing himself he had probably kicked it without realizing, or maybe it had tumbled loose from somewhere. Eventually, he relaxed, climbed into his sleeping bag beneath the tarp, and drifted to sleep. Hours later, he woke abruptly. The same heavy sense of dread had returned, stronger this time. He couldn't see or hear anything, but the feeling that something was wrong was undeniable. Then he caught it, the faint crunch of leaves, like footsteps, about 30 to 40 meters away. At first, he couldn't tell if they were moving toward him or away, but after half a minute, the sound faded. He told himself whoever or whatever it was had left. Still uneasy, he decided to grab his flashlight and shine it in that direction. He reached beside him where he had left it earlier, but his hand came up empty. Confused, he patted the ground. Nothing. His flashlight was gone. Alarm bells rang in his head. The only way it could be missing is if someone or something had taken it. He scrambled out of his sleeping bag, ducking under the tarp, frantically searching the ground. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted light reflecting. Turning, he saw his flashlight lying on the ground 10 meters away, which meant something had been close enough within inches of his sleeping body to pick it up and move it while he lay helpless. His first thought, it's a trap. Whoever did this wanted him to leave the safety of his camp and walk into the dark. A wave of nausea hit him from fear, but he forced himself to stay calm. He laced his boots, grabbed his knife, and made a decision he wasn't going anywhere near that flashlight. Instead, he fed his fire higher and higher, determined to keep it blazing as long as possible. For hours, he stood in the center of the clearing, knife in hand, watching and waiting. Every so often, he'd hear those same rustling footsteps creeping closer, always coming nearer when the fire burned low, pulling back when he stoked it higher. It was a terrifying game of patience. But by 3 a.m., his firewood was gone. Unless he ventured into the forest for more, which he absolutely would not, his fire was going to die. As the flames dwindled, the footsteps returned. This time, closer. At first, they stopped 15 meters out. Then, as the fire shrank further, they crept to within 3. Whoever or whatever was there positioned themselves behind a dense cluster of trees, deliberately staying just out of sight. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. And then, silence. For 2 hours, Sam stood frozen, staring at those trees, certain something was lurking behind them, waiting. Finally, just before sunrise, the presence retreated. He heard the steps fade into the woods and never return. When daylight finally broke, Sam didn't bolt immediately. He waited until the clearing was fully lit by the sun before quickly packing up. Then he practically sprinted down the trail, didn't stop until he reached the parking lot, and sped 20 miles straight to the nearest gas station. Breathless, he got out of his car to collect himself. That's when he noticed something new. On the dusty rear window of his vehicle, someone had traced a message with their finger. It read, "Sleep well?" Sam is certain the person or group that stalked him in the Superstition Mountains was the same one that left that chilling note on his car. And he still wonders what might have happened if he had gone to retrieve that flashlight. In 1982, a teenage boy and girl who had only recently started dating but already shared a passion for the outdoors decided to spend a weekend camping in Maine. On their very first night at around 1 a.m., the girl woke suddenly because she needed to use the bathroom. She reached for the zipper of their tent flap, but froze when her ears caught a strange noise outside. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. The sound of digging. Something or someone was clawing at the dirt just a few feet away. Her first instinct was to dismiss it as some small animal, but curiosity tugged at her. She slowly unzipped the tent just enough to peer out, and since there was a clearing under the moonlight, visibility was fairly good. What she saw nearly made her faint. Just a couple of feet away crouched a grown woman, her back to the tent, furiously clawing at the earth as though trying to unearth something. The girl gasped, stumbling backward into her boyfriend. He shot awake, startled, and asked what was wrong. She silenced him with a panicked gesture and pointed at the slit in the tent. He leaned forward to look, and there she was. A strange woman, digging frantically into the soil with her bare hands. Shocked, the boy grabbed a flashlight, despite his girlfriend's pleas not to. He unzipped the tent a bit more and shone the beam directly on her. The woman froze, slowly stood, and turned to face them. Her expression was utterly blank, neither aggressive nor afraid, just empty. For several long seconds, she stared directly at them in silence, then calmly turned and walked into the woods. The couple sat in stunned silence for several minutes, then unzipped the tent completely and stepped outside to make sure she was gone. They swept their flashlights across the clearing, but she had vanished. They approached the spot where she had been digging and found only a shallow hole 4 inches deep with no obvious purpose. Confused and unsettled, they decided the best thing to do was to report it to the rangers in the morning. Feeling a little more secure that she had left, they zipped the tent and tried to go back to sleep. Minutes later, the sound of running feet jolted them. She was back. When they looked outside, the woman wasn't digging this time, she was rummaging through their gear scattered around the camp. Her movements were erratic, almost animalistic. She'd pick up an item, glance at it, then hurl it behind her, repeating the process over and over. The boy stormed out of the tent, shining the flashlight on her. "You need to leave," he yelled. She ignored him, continuing to toss their belongings like a wild animal. Only when he raised his voice, threatening and forceful, did she stop and turn toward him with a confused look, as if she were surprised they were even there. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away again. They stood guard outside their tent for 15 minutes, making as much noise as possible, hoping to scare her off. Finally, convinced she wouldn't come back, they zipped themselves inside again. But within moments, they heard her charging back into camp. This time, she sprinted straight to the hole she had been digging and frantically clawed at the dirt with even more desperation. Furious and terrified, the couple burst out of the tent, screaming at her to get away. Their sudden aggression seemed to startle her. She scrambled to her feet and bolted into the woods, but the way she ran was strange. On all fours, at times, her movements almost feral. Shaken, the teenagers realized she wasn't just trespassing. Something was deeply wrong with this woman. They sat by their lanterns and flashlights for the next 2 hours, waiting, listening, hoping she was truly gone. But when exhaustion overcame them around 3:30 a.m., they convinced themselves it was finally safe, zipped up the tent, and went to sleep. When morning came, they unzipped the tent to find chaos. Their gear was scattered across the clearing, strewn in every direction, as though she had come back yet again while they slept. The hole she had been digging was now over a foot deep, far deeper than before. And the most disturbing realization of all, during those 2 hours when they thought she was gone, she must have been lurking just out of sight in the shadows, watching them, waiting for them to let their guard down. Yet, when they examined their belongings, nothing was missing. She hadn't stolen anything, not even valuable items she could have easily taken. She had only dug and scattered. Horrified, they packed up immediately and reported everything to the park ranger. But the ranger admitted he had no idea what to make of it. He had never heard of such an encounter. The teenagers left that day, refusing to spend another night there. And to this day, they have no explanation for who or what that woman was, why she obsessively dug into the earth, or why she kept coming back like some kind of wild, feral creature. In 2016, a 25-year-old Wall Street banker named Matt decided he needed a break. His job was so demanding that whenever he got a chance, he escaped into the wilderness for a few days to reset his mind. Though he lived in one of the busiest cities in the world, he was actually an experienced outdoorsman. For this trip, he headed into the backcountry near Mount Rainier in Washington state, far off any marked trails, determined to be as isolated as possible. On his first night, Matt found a small clearing surrounded by trees. He built a fire, cooked a simple meal, set up his tent, and climbed inside. Within minutes, he was fast asleep. But hours later, strange sounds woke him. Something was moving outside heavy, deliberate steps, like an animal pacing just beyond his tent. Curious but cautious, he unzipped the flap, just a crack, and peeked out. His fire had gone out, but in the faint moonlight, he saw something that made his stomach drop. A man was sitting by his fire pit, where there was no fire, just sitting with his hands resting on his knees, staring at the ground. Occasionally, the figure nudged the ashes with his foot, scattering them. Matt froze, terrified. Then, as if sensing his gaze, the man suddenly looked up, locking eyes with him through the slit in the tent. His eyes went wide. In an instant, he stood up, turned, and sprinted into the woods. Matt bolted out of his tent with his flashlight, sweeping the forest for any sign of him. Surely, he thought, there had to be another camp nearby. He'd see a fire, a lantern, something. But the forest was pitch black. No light sources, no sign of a campsite, nothing. Eventually, unsettled and confused, he crawled back into his tent, zipped it shut, and lay awake the rest of the night, replaying the scene in his mind. When morning came, he convinced himself there must be some rational explanation. Maybe it was just another camper who got lost or wandered over in the dark. He packed up, pulled out his map and compass, and set off deeper into the backcountry. For the next 2 days, Matt zigzagged through the wilderness, covering at least 10 to 15 miles in random directions, deliberately keeping off any trails. He found another clearing and set up camp again. As night fell, he built a fire and started eating. That's when he heard rustling behind him. At first, he brushed it off as an animal, but when the noise came again, deliberate and closer this time, he stood, listening. And then, from the shadows, a man's voice called out, "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" Matt's blood ran cold. He hadn't seen another person in days. He was miles from the nearest trail, and he instantly knew it had to be the same man from 2 nights before. Somehow, he had followed him. Forcing calm into his voice, Matt called back, "I don't know where that is." The forest went silent again. He hoped the stranger would step into the firelight, prove to be just a lost hiker. But instead, the voice came again, sharper this time, repeating the same question. "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" Now Matt was terrified. He gripped his flashlight, took a breath, and snapped the beam toward the voice. There, peering out from behind a tree, was the man. The same wide-eyed expression, the same sudden stillness. The moment the light hit him, he barked angrily at Matt to lower it. Instinctively, Matt did, and when he raised it again moments later, the man was gone. For several minutes, Matt stood frozen, heart pounding, expecting the man to reappear. Instead, silence closed in around him. Hours crawled by, and though nothing else happened that night, Matt didn't sleep a second. At dawn, he packed quickly and began the long trek back toward his car. But all day, he couldn't shake the feeling he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder constantly, sure the man was still following. By nightfall, he was still too far from the trailhead to make it out. Exhausted, he reluctantly set up camp again. This time, he went straight into his tent, knife clutched in his hand. Hours later, the footsteps returned. Someone was circling his tent, slow and steady. For the entire night, the stranger walked around and around, pausing just long enough for Matt's nerves to shred before moving again. Then, just before dawn, the sound faded. When morning came, Matt ran. He didn't stop to rest, didn't bother with food or water breaks, he just wanted out. All day he pushed forward, still sure the man was trailing him. But as the sun sank again, he realized he wouldn't make it out before dark. Once again, he set up camp. That night, he lay in his tent, exhausted and on edge. Hours passed in silence, and he began to wonder if maybe the nightmare was finally over. But then, just as he started to relax, a voice drifted out of the woods. "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" Matt's heart raced so violently he thought it might stop. He sat frozen, gripping his knife. Suddenly, the man's footsteps pounded past his camp, accompanied by guttural animal sounds, moaning, grunting, kicking up leaves. Over and over, he circled, darted past, then vanished into the trees, only to return again. This continued until daylight broke. When the sun finally rose, Matt tore down his tent, packed his things in record time, and sprinted the rest of the way to his car. The moment he got inside, he locked the doors, broke down in tears of relief, and sped away. Later, safe in a hotel with cell service, he considered calling the police. But what would he even say? The man hadn't technically broken any laws, he hadn't attacked him. He had just followed him relentlessly, impossibly, for 3 days, across 30 miles of rugged terrain, without a flashlight, without any visible supplies, repeating only one question: "Do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" On the 27th of April, 1997, a farmer in Indonesia was leading his livestock through a dense sugarcane field near his home when his foot struck something unusual. He looked down and noticed a mound of dirt that seemed oddly out of place. For a moment, he considered digging, but since the land wasn't his, he chose to leave it alone and instead reported the strange discovery to the village head. The leader, accompanied by several men, returned to the field and began poking at the mound with a stick. Immediately, a terrible stench seeped into the air, so foul that it forced them to back away. Alarmed, they informed the authorities, who ordered the men to dig further. After just a few minutes of shoveling, their spades struck something soft. With a mix of fear and dread, they brushed away the dirt until a young woman's face appeared, her body buried upright, her head protruding from the soil. Police soon identified the victim as 21-year-old DWI, who had last been seen 3 days earlier when she left home to run a simple errand. That same day, a 15-year-old rickshaw driver came forward with crucial information. He told investigators that on the 24th of April, the night DWI disappeared, she had hired him for a ride. Instead of giving him a clear destination, she only instructed him to travel in a certain direction, saying she would guide him further along the way. When he pressed her, she reluctantly admitted she was going to see a local shaman. The police traced this man, a 45-year-old named Ahmad Siraji. At first, he denied any involvement, claiming he had not seen DWI at all. But when police searched his home and found her belongings inside, his facade crumbled. Without hesitation and almost disturbingly calm, he confessed. He admitted not only to killing DWI, but to murdering dozens of women the same way and burying them in the sugarcane fields. Authorities returned to the fields and began excavating. All around were suspicious mounds of soil. As they dug, body after body surfaced, all buried in shallow graves, positioned upright, their heads left above ground. By the end, investigators believed they had found 42 victims, though the true number could have been higher. When asked why he had done it, Siraji gave a chilling explanation. He claimed that in 1986, he experienced a vivid dream in which his deceased father appeared to him and instructed him to drink the saliva of 70 women. If he succeeded, he would become immortal. Siraji didn't dismiss this as just a bizarre dream. He took it as a sacred command. But he had no idea how to collect saliva willingly from 70 people. After brooding on it, he decided the most efficient way was to kill them and extract it by force. To lure victims, he carefully built a reputation as a mystical healer. He spread word that he possessed supernatural powers and could grant women everlasting beauty and prosperity. The rumor spread quickly, drawing women not only from his village, but from surrounding areas. When they arrived at his home, he demanded a steep fee, roughly $300, then insisted on performing a secret ritual at night. Leading them through a cemetery and into the sugarcane fields, he handed each victim a shovel and told her to dig a hole as part of the ceremony. Once the pit was waist deep, he instructed her to climb in, stand with her arms at her sides, and remain still. If she hesitated, he soothed her fears, assuring her that many had done it before, that it was safe, and that this was the only way the magic would work. When the woman complied, he filled the hole back in, trapping her in place. Then he strangled her with a cable until she stopped breathing. After she was dead, he pulled her from the hole, took her saliva, then dug the hole deeper and reburied her, always leaving her head exposed and always facing his house. He explained that he believed having these women's faces turned toward him gave him even greater power. In Dwight's case, she had grown nervous after paying the fee and initially wanted to back out. To calm her, Siraji enlisted his wife. She had no idea her husband was a serial killer, so when he told her to reassure DWI, she went along, promising the girl it was safe. She even offered to accompany them. Comforted, DWI reluctantly agreed to continue. Hours later, only Siraji and his wife returned. In 2008, Ahmad Siraji was executed by firing squad for his crimes. His wife, convicted of helping lure victims into the deadly rituals, was sentenced to life in prison. In 2010, a 17-year-old boy was devastated when his father suddenly passed away. The loss shattered the family. Not only did they grieve for their husband and father, but the spaces where they had shared the happiest memories suddenly felt hollow. One of those places was their cabin near Mount Bachelor in Oregon, a beautiful retreat where the family had spent winters skiing, snowboarding, and hunting together. After the father's death, the family decided to sell the cabin. But before it was gone forever, the boy asked his mother if he could spend a few days there, one last chance to honor his father's memory in the place they loved so much. She agreed, and with his father's car, which had been willed to him, and the family dog Midnight, he set out for the cabin with snacks, drinks, and plans to play games, snowboard, and remember, the cabin itself was 2 stories built into the side of the mountain. The back was pressed into the slope with no windows except a small one in the bathroom. The front was wide open, lined with glass panes and a balcony off the master bedroom. It stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded on all sides by dense pine forest. Among the trees in front of the house was one that stood out, a tall pine with a thick horizontal branch about 20 feet up, perfectly shaped like a seat facing the cabin. The boy called it the sitting tree. For the first 2 days, the stay was everything he had hoped for. He played video games, ate snacks, took midnight out to roam, and even went snowboarding. It felt almost like he was bonding with his father again. But on the third morning, after a heavy snowstorm, he stepped outside with Midnight and noticed something that unsettled him. Fresh footprints in the snow prints that weren't his led from the woods to the clearing and then circled around the back of the cabin, disappearing up the slope. He told himself it must have been a hiker or a neighbor, though both were unlikely. Still, he forced himself to shake it off. That night, he locked every door and window, drew the blackout curtains, and went upstairs to bed with Midnight. Hours later, the dog suddenly perked up, staring at the stairs. Then, without warning, she bolted down to the front door, pacing and whining to be let out. Uneasy, the boy finally gave in, opened the door, and followed Midnight into the snow. Instead of using the bathroom, she froze, staring toward the tree line, body tense, her gaze locked on to the sitting tree. The boy's nerves flared. He grabbed the dog, dragged her back inside, locked the door, shut the blinds, and went upstairs. Midnight refused to get into bed, choosing instead to stand near the stairs, ears pricked, body on edge. Minutes passed in silence. Then came the sound. 6 distinct, deliberate footsteps directly above him, on the roof. They sounded heavy, not like an animal's paws, but like hooves, clopping slowly from one side of the cabin to the other. His blood ran cold. There was no way a deer or moose could climb onto the roof. Midnight stared at the ceiling, then whipped her head toward the balcony door, growling low in her throat. Terrified but desperate to know, the boy mustered the courage to slide open the blackout curtain. The balcony was buried in snow, the night thick and silent. He opened the door, flashlight in hand, and swept the beam across the roof. Nothing. Then he scanned the clearing, the trees, the sitting tree. And there, perched 20 feet up on that thick branch, crouched a figure. A tall man, impossibly balanced, clutching the branch above him, mouth open wide, eyes locked, unblinking on the boy. The flashlight slipped from his hand, heart pounding. He fumbled to pick it up, swung the beam back toward the tree, but the branch was empty. No man, no sound, just the black wall of forest. He yanked Midnight inside, slammed the door, locked it, and pulled the curtains shut. Upstairs, they huddled together in bed. Midnight no longer wanted to go outside. Then came the tapping. Soft at first, like a single finger rapping against glass. At the front door. Then silence. Then tapping again, this time on the walls, moving slowly around the cabin. He held his breath, listening as it shifted to the tiny bathroom window just feet from where he lay. Then it circled the house, tapping each side in turn. He could picture it walking in slow circles around his home, testing every wall, every window, as if it was deciding where to come in. Hours dragged by. Then came the heaviest blow, footsteps on the balcony. And then the tapping again, right on the sliding glass doors to his bedroom. The sound was inches away, separated only by thin curtains and glass. He couldn't move. He couldn't even breathe. The tapping continued, steady, patient. Then it stopped and began again on the roof, directly above him. He lay frozen in terror as the sound went on, until finally the first light of dawn broke through. When the sun rose, he pulled the curtains back. The balcony was empty, but footprints stamped the snow footprints that paced back and forth all night long. He looked up at the roof and saw more tracks. They circled the cabin like a predator stalking prey, then trailed off toward the sitting tree before vanishing into the woods. Shaken and exhausted, he packed his things, loaded Midnight into the car, and left. The cabin was sold shortly after. He never returned. It was around 8:30 p.m. on December 29th, 1972, when passengers at JFK International Airport in Queens, New York, heard over the intercom that Eastern Airlines Flight 401 to Miami was now boarding. About 30 minutes later, all 176 people, including 13 crew members, were seated on board. This wasn't just any airplane. Flight 401 was one of Eastern's brand new Lockheed L-1011 TriStars, a massive, state-of-the-art jet capable of holding up to 400 passengers. It had two levels, the main cabin above and a lower deck with a galley kitchen and a lounge just for the crew. That night, Captain Robert Bob Loft was in command. He was 55, strikingly handsome, a perfectionist, with more than 30 zero-hours of flight time. Sitting to his right was First Officer Bert Stockstill, 10 years younger. Behind them was the flight engineer, Don Repo, a strong man with a gentle, approachable demeanor. And in the fourth cockpit seat was Angelo Donadeo, another Eastern Airlines employee hitching a ride to Miami. At 9:20 p.m., Flight 401 thundered down the runway and climbed into the night sky. For the next 2 hours, everything was routine. One passenger, Jerry Escow, was so impressed that he even wrote a letter mid-flight praising Eastern for how smooth the trip was, intending to mail it when they landed. But at 11:32 p.m., everything changed. As Captain Loft began his approach into Miami, he lowered the landing gear. On the L-1011, there are 3 sets of wheels, one under each wing and one under the nose. Each set has a corresponding green indicator light in the cockpit that comes on when the gear locks into place. This time, only 2 lights came on. The nose gear light stayed dark. Loft and his crew assumed the landing gear was fine, the plane was brand new, the problem had to be the bulb. But to be safe, Loft retracted the gear and lowered it again. Still, the nose gear light did not illuminate. Frustrated, he radioed Miami Air Traffic Control, explaining the situation. They instructed him to circle out over the Everglades until the issue was resolved. Loft engaged the autopilot to hold 0 feet and 200 miles per hour, while he and Stockstill fiddled with the tiny bulb. They pressed it, twisted it, even pulled it out and blew on it. Nothing. When they jammed it back in, sideways, and couldn't remove it, Loft turned to Repo and told him to climb down into the hellhole, a small compartment beneath the cockpit with a window where you could visually confirm if the nose gear was down. Repo got out of his seat and climbed below. What no one noticed was that when Loft turned in his chair to speak to Repo, he likely nudged the control column just enough to disengage the autopilot. The massive jet began a slow, steady descent, but it was pitch black outside, no moon, no lights, just an endless void. The descent was so gradual, it didn't feel like falling. And everyone in the cockpit was so focused on that single light bulb that when the altitude warning sounded quietly, just once, it went unnoticed. At 11:42 p.m., Flight 401 slammed into the Everglades at more than 200 miles per hour. 5 miles away, a man named Robert Marquis, out hunting frogs with a friend on an airboat, saw the massive orange flash. He fired up his boat and sped toward it. The impact was catastrophic, but oddly survivable for some. Because the descent was shallow and the Everglades were soft, muddy terrain, the crash wasn't as instantly fatal as it might have been. Of the 176 on board, 77 survived. Captain Loft, First Officer Stockstill, and Flight Engineer Repo did not. Marquis and his friend were the first on scene, pulling survivors from the wreckage until Coast Guard helicopters arrived. By morning, the cries for help had gone silent. The investigation would reveal the nose gear had been fine all along. The light bulb had simply burned out. The official cause was human error. But that was not the end of Flight 401's story. In the months and years that followed, something strange began happening inside Eastern Airlines. Employees started reporting eerie encounters, ghostly apparitions of Captain Loft, of Don Repo. Silent, watchful, appearing on flights that had salvaged parts taken from the wreckage of 401. Eastern Airlines pressured employees to stay quiet, reports were buried, logbooks went missing. But some crew members, shaken by what they'd seen, came forward anonymously. One flight attendant swore she saw Repo in the galley kitchen. Another time, during boarding, an extra captain appeared in first class. He sat silently, staring straight ahead. When approached, he gave no response. Then, in front of multiple witnesses, including crew and passengers, he vanished into thin air. That captain was identified as Bob Loft. There were dozens of such sightings, sometimes terrifying, sometimes helpful. On one flight, Repo's apparition reportedly warned a captain about a malfunction in an engine. When checked, the malfunction was real. By 1974, all the sightings suddenly stopped. Why? Eastern Airlines quietly removed all salvaged parts from their L-1011 fleet. They never gave a reason. But after that, the ghosts of Flight 401 were never seen again. On the evening of January 12, 2016, 18-year-old Dylan Parker was at a party in his hometown of Osburn, Idaho. Late into the night, he decided it was time to leave. Since it was snowing and bitterly cold outside, Dylan phoned his mother and asked if she could meet him at the gas station just down the road from where the party was being held. When his mother answered, she could immediately tell Dylan had been drinking, his voice was slurred, and he sounded unsteady. She was angry because he was underage, but despite her frustration, her priority was to get her son home safely. She told herself she could deal with his behavior tomorrow, and she agreed to pick him up. As she drove toward the gas station, her phone rang again. This time, Dylan's voice was frantic, panicked. He demanded to know where she was, sounding almost terrified. His mother tried to calm him down, explaining she was only a minute away and would be there shortly. Then the call suddenly ended. When she pulled into the gas station, Dylan was nowhere to be seen. She tried to call him back, but now his phone was switched off. She went inside the gas station, asking if anyone had seen her son. The employees said no. Back in her car, she drove around for half an hour, shouting Dylan's name, but there was no trace of him. His phone remained off, a sick feeling grew in her stomach, and eventually she contacted the police to report him missing. Investigators began by searching the party house where Dylan had last been seen. Friends confirmed that he seemed fine when he left, simply telling them his mom was picking him up. Authorities expanded their search across town, but they came up empty. For days, nothing turned up. Then, 10 days later, Dylan's body was discovered by accident. Two people had crashed their ATVs during a late-night ride. When they returned the next day to retrieve their vehicles, they stumbled upon Dylan's remains. His body was found outside of town, high on a forested hillside. To reach this location, Dylan would have had to walk in the opposite direction of the gas station. Toxicology reports showed he had consumed alcohol.